Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, leaving a like and subscribing helps this little channel find its way back to you on those nights when you can't sleep, without you having to search for it. And if you have a moment, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Maybe it's a quiet evening in Ohio, a cozy little home somewhere in Devon, or a peaceful night in Tasmania with your dog curled up nearby. Leave it in the comments. I really do read every single one. All right, my friend, let us begin. The year is 878, and in a low, marshy stretch of land in the west of what will one day be called England, a fire is being coaxed back to life before dawn. This is the hand of a man named Ceolwulf, a freeman farmer with land enough to keep his family fed in most years, and hungry in the bad ones, and this year has been one of the bad ones, though not for the reasons you might expect. The harvest was decent. The trouble is that a king with no kingdom left to speak of is currently hiding somewhere in the wetlands, not far from Ceolwulf's own fields, and everyone in this part of Wessex has spent the winter holding their breath, waiting to find out whether they will still have a country to call their own by spring. That king is Alfred. You likely know the name. What you may not know is how close it came to disappearing entirely, how in this particular winter he is not yet the Alfred of legend, not yet the Alfred who gets his own statue in Winchester 1,000 years later. Right now he is a man in his late 20s, hiding in a fort built on an island of firm ground surrounded by bog and reed, having lost nearly everything a king is supposed to have: his hall, his treasury. Most of his army, scattered to their own farms after a Viking force under a commander named Guthrum, swept through Wessex in the days after Twelfth Night and caught the entire kingdom flat-footed during the one stretch of the calendar when nobody expected a war to start. Ceolwulf does not know Alfred personally. He has seen him twice in his life, both times from a distance, both times at gatherings where men like Ceolwulf stood at the back and watched men of higher rank speak among themselves. But Ceolwulf knows what it means for the king to be missing. It means the roads are not safe the way they used to be. It means the manor lord who normally collects a portion of his grain sent no one to collect it this year, because the manor lord himself fled east with his household, rather than risk finding out what a Viking raiding party does to a man who stays and waits. It means, more than anything, an uncertainty that sits in the chest like a held breath, because nobody in this small farmstead knows on this particular morning whether the world they wake into will look anything like the world they fall asleep in. And yet, here is Ceolwulf, blowing gently on embers that refuse to die overnight, feeding them a few dry twigs kept just for this purpose in a clay pot by the hearth, and around him the ordinary business of a household waking continues exactly as it has continued for generations, because a family still has to eat whether or not the king can be found. Beside him, Aethelgifu is already awake this particular morning, though most mornings it is the other way around. She sits near the hearth with a wooden bowl in her lap, working through the last of the previous night's barley that's soaked overnight to soften it for the porridge that will be the first meal of the day. Her hands move without her needing to watch them, the kind of motion built from 10,000 repetitions, and her mind is somewhere else entirely, on the older of their two sons, a boy of 14 named Wulfstan, who left 3 days ago with 2 other young men from neighbouring farms to see if they could find word of the king. This was not exactly permitted, and it was not exactly forbidden either. Ceolwulf had grumbled about it, the way a father grumbles about a decision he has already privately accepted, and Aethelgifu had said very little at all, which in a marriage of 18 years is its own kind of language, and now she sits working barley with her jaw held slightly tight, waiting for a boy who is, by any reasonable measure, still mostly a child, to come walking back up the muddy track that leads to their door. There is a particular quality to worry in a world without any way to send word ahead. No letter can travel faster than the person carrying it. No message outruns the traveller, so a mother in 878 does not check for news. She simply waits, and the waiting has a physical weight to it, something she carries in her shoulders and in the set of her mouth, something Ceolwulf notices without saying anything about it, because there is nothing useful to say. Their younger child is a girl of 8 named Edgith, and she is still asleep behind the willow partition, curled against the warmth of a woolen blanket, dyed a soft brownish red with madder root, a colour that has faded unevenly over years of washing, so that one corner is nearly the original deep colour and the rest has gone the pale rust of an autumn leaf. In a moment she will wake to the sound of the hens being let out, and she will lie there for a few extra seconds in the particular stillness of a child who is awake but not yet ready to admit it, listening to her parents' voices low across the room, letting the sounds of the house arrange themselves into a familiar order before she gets up to face the day. Outside, the light is only just beginning to grey the sky in the east. The fields beyond the house lie mostly fallow this time of year. Dark, furrowed earth waiting for spring sowing, and past the fields, low and half-hidden in morning mist, are the wetlands that have swallowed a king. This is Somerset, though nobody here would call it that exactly. The name still centuries away from settling into its familiar form. What matters is the geography itself, and the geography here is strange and useful in equal measure. Rivers braid and wander through low ground that floods every winter, creating a landscape of islands, some large enough to farm, some barely large enough to stand on, connected by causeways that only the people who live here truly know how to read, and paths that disappear entirely under high water. It is exactly the kind of terrain where a small band of desperate men can vanish, and exactly the kind of terrain where a much larger force, unfamiliar with the ground, can wander for days and never find what they are looking for. Alfred's stronghold, a fortified island called Athelney, sits within this maze, and though Ceolwulf's own farmstead is not close enough to see it, everyone in the region knows roughly where it is, the way you know where a neighbour lives even if you have never had reason to visit. There is a story going around, and Ceolwulf heard it 3 nights ago from a travelling pedlar who stopped to trade a length of iron nails for a portion of cheese, a story that has likely already changed shape several times in the telling, and will change further still before it settles into the version future generations will know. It concerns a woman, a swineherd's wife, who did not recognise the king when he showed up cold and exhausted at her door asking for shelter, and who left him minding a batch of cakes baking on the hearth while she went off to attend to something else, and who came back to find the cakes burned black because the king, brooding over the ruin of his kingdom, had forgotten entirely that he was supposed to be watching them, and who scolded him soundly for his carelessness, without having the faintest idea she was scolding her own sovereign. Ceolwulf does not know whether to believe it. Something about it feels almost too neat, too much like the kind of story people tell because they need their king to still be human, still capable of forgetting a small thing while carrying the weight of a large one. But he likes it regardless, and he has already told it to Ethelgifu, who laughed for the first time in 2 days when she heard it. A short surprised laugh that made the tightness around her eyes ease for just a moment before the worry settled back in. The fire is properly going now, orange light licking up through split kindling, and Ceolwulf sets a larger log across it before straightening, one hand pressed briefly against the small of his back, a habit worn into him by years of work that asks more of a body than it can comfortably give. He is 36 years old, which by the standards of this century is not young, and the years show in him the way they show in most men who farm their own land, in the permanent brownish weathering of his face and forearms, in the particular stiffness that settles into his joints on cold mornings, in hands that have gone thick and calloused, in a way that no longer fully closes flat. He crosses to the door, a heavy plank set on iron hinges, and lifts the wooden bar that holds it shut against the night, and pushes it open to a morning that smells of wet earth and distant wood smoke from other households doing exactly what his own household is doing. The hens are already stirring in their woven enclosure at the side of the house, a rough structure of wattle fencing meant less to keep them in than to keep foxes out, though it does an imperfect job of either. Edgith, it turns out, has decided the morning has begun after all, and she comes padding out from behind the willow partition in bare feet despite the cold floor, her hair still tangled from sleep, already talking before she's fully through the doorway, asking whether the brown hen laid again because the brown hen has been unreliable all month, and Edgith has taken this personally, the way children take the small failures of animals personally. Her mother tells her to fetch her shoes before her feet freeze to the floor, which is an exaggeration, but the kind of exaggeration mothers are allowed. Edgith ignores this, as children have always ignored such instructions and go straight to the enclosure, crouching to peer through the woven fencing with the particular seriousness small children bring to small tasks. There is something worth sitting with here for a moment before we move on. A household like this one measures its wealth not in coin, which most people in this world rarely handle at all, but in livestock, in stored grain, in the number of working hands under one roof. Ceolwulf is what history will later call a ceorl, a free peasant, which sits below the nobility but well above the enslaved and the landless labourers who work for others because they have no ground of their own to work. He owns his land outright, or as close to outright as anyone owns anything in a kingdom where the king's peace is the thing that ultimately guarantees any of it means something. He could, in theory, be called up for the fyrd, the levy of free men expected to fight when the king summons them, and in fact he was called up twice already this past year, which is part of why the harvest took longer than it should have, and why the family's stores are thinner than Æthelgifu would like heading into this particular winter. This is the texture that tends to get lost when people picture the Viking Age. Not two armies meeting on an open field, though that happens too, but a farmer pulled away from his fields at the worst possible moment, twice in 1 year, to stand in a shield wall he never asked to stand in, then sent home again to somehow make up the lost time before the ground freezes. A dog trots out from somewhere behind the house, a lean brindled animal with one ear permanently folded from some old injury, and noses at Eadgith's ankles before flopping down in a patch of ground, already faintly warmed by the rising sun. This is not a pet in the sense a modern household would recognise. The dog earns its keep, herding what few sheep the family owns, warning of strangers on the track, and it sleeps outside except on the coldest nights, when it's sometimes allowed near the hearth as a small mercy. Æthelgifu calls the family in for the morning meal, and this is worth pausing on too, because it will not look like breakfast as you know it. The barley she soaked overnight has become a thick porridge, cooked slowly in the iron pot that hangs from a chain over the fire, flavoured with nothing more elaborate than a handful of dried herbs and, on better mornings, a spoonful of honey stirred through at the end. There is bread from 2 days prior, dense and dark, made from a mixture of barley and rye because wheat is expensive and mostly reserved for special occasions or for those with higher status, and the bread has gone slightly stale, so it gets torn into pieces and dropped into the porridge to soften. There is no coffee, obviously no tea, nothing hot to drink at all, beyond perhaps a weak ale brewed at home, low in alcohol, closer to what we might call a mild beer, and consumed by everyone in the household including the children, partly for the calories and partly because the water itself is not always safe to drink without something done to it first. The family eats sitting on low benches along the wall, bowls balanced on knees, spoons carved from horn or wood, and the meal does not take long. There is no leisure in a morning like this one. Work is waiting, and the work does not care what happened to the king last month, or what might happen to him next. Wulfstan's absence sits at the table with them the way an empty chair does, though there is no empty chair exactly, just a space where a 14-year-old's voice should be, usually complaining about some chore or another, usually the loudest person in the room without meaning to be. Æthelgifu eats without tasting much of anything, and Ceolwulf notices this without commenting on it, and Aegith, too young yet to fully carry the weight of that particular kind of worry, chatters about the hen and about a bird she saw yesterday with a strange white patch on its wing, and her chatter is, in its own small way, doing the family a favour, filling a silence that might otherwise have grown too heavy to sit inside of. Let us leave this farmstead for a moment, though we will return to it, because there is a wider world moving around this family that is worth stepping into. A few miles distant, closer to where the marshland thickens into something nearly impassable to anyone who does not know its paths, stands the fortification at Athelney, and inside it, on this same grey morning, a king who has lost nearly everything is doing something almost unglamorous. He is listening to a report. The man giving the report is one of Alfred's ealdormen, a nobleman named Athelnoth, who governs the Shire of Somerset, and who has over these past desperate weeks become one of the small handful of men Alfred can fully trust, because trust in this moment is a currency more valuable than gold, given how many lesser lords chose flight or quiet accommodation with the Danes over loyalty to a king who seemed, as recently as January, to be finished. Alfred at this point in his life is not the imposing, legendary figure later centuries will carve into stone. He is a man plagued by chronic illness, something that causes him recurring, painful episodes that no physician of this era can properly name, something modern historians still debate the nature of, whether it was Crohn's disease or a form of epilepsy or something else entirely lost to time. He suffers, and he suffers in a way that he mostly hides from the men around him, because a king who visibly suffers is a king whose authority visibly weakens, and authority is the one resource he cannot currently afford to spend. What Alfred is doing at Athelney, beyond simply surviving, is something quietly remarkable, something that will matter enormously for how this story ends, though nobody around him yet knows it will matter. He is sending out word, carefully, through trusted men moving along paths only locals know, calling for the third of 3 shires, Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire, to gather at a specific place and a specific time roughly 7 weeks from now. He is not simply hiding. He is rebuilding, quietly, patiently, out of almost nothing, the way a man rebuilds a house from the 2 or 3 timbers that survived a fire. There is a detail here that I find worth lingering on. Alfred, even now, even at what is arguably the lowest point of his entire reign, is still doing the unglamorous administrative work of kingship. Messages are being drafted, oaths are being reaffirmed. Someone, somewhere in this fortified camp, is keeping track of which local landowners have sent food, which have sent men, which have gone quiet in a way that might mean caution or might mean betrayal. None of this looks like the version of history we tend to imagine, the swords and the banners and the speeches before battle. It looks like a man at a table, tired, likely in some degree of physical pain, doing paperwork that might save a kingdom. Back at the farmstead, the morning has moved on without waiting for anyone's permission, the way mornings do. Ceolwulf has gone out to check on the sheep, a small flock of perhaps a dozen animals kept mostly for wool rather than meat, since a sheep slaughtered is a sheep that can no longer be sheared year after year, and wool, more than most people realize, is close to the beating heart of this entire economy. Every part of clothing in this household, and in nearly every household across Wessex, begins as raw fleece, and the journey from fleece to finished garment is long enough that it touches nearly every member of the family at some point in the year. It is Athel-Gifu who does most of this work, though not alone. She washes the raw wool to remove the natural grease and dirt, then combs or cards it to align the fibres, working with a pair of wooden paddles studded with iron teeth that pull the wool into something closer to workable strands. From there it is spun, and this is the task you would find her doing in nearly any spare moment of any day, a drop spindle twirling from her fingers as naturally as breathing, thread lengthening steadily as she walks, as she stirs a pot, as she watches the children, because spinning is the one craft flexible enough to be done alongside almost anything else. The spun thread eventually finds its way to a loom, a simple upright frame set against one wall of the house, warp threads hanging with small clay or stone weights at the bottom to keep them taut. And weaving on a loom like this is slow, physical work, requiring the weaver to stand for long stretches, passing the weft thread through by hand, beating each row firm with a long wooden beater. A single length of cloth sufficient for a garment might take many days of dedicated effort, spread across weeks of a life that has other demands on it too. And once woven, the cloth still is not finished. It might be dyed, using whatever plants and materials the local land provides. Madder root for the reddish tones like the one on Addic's blanket, woad for blue, various barks and lichens for shades of brown and yellow, walnut hulls for a deep umber that stains the hands of whoever works with it for days afterward. It is cut and sewn using needles of bone or bronze and thread spun even finer than the weaving thread, and only then, after this entire chain of labour stretching back months, does it become the tunic Ceolwulf wears, or the overdress Athel-Gifu wears, or the small garments that Addic seems to outgrow faster than anyone can keep pace with. I mention all of this not to overwhelm you with process, but because there is something in it worth feeling rather than simply knowing. Every piece of cloth in this house represents an almost unimaginable quantity of hours. hours mostly invisible to history, mostly performed by women, mostly never written down anywhere, because nobody at the time thought to record what everyone already understood. We remember the kings. We remember the battles. We rarely remember the thousands of hours of spinning that clothed the men who fought in those battles, though without it there would have been no wool cloaks against the cold, no padded garments beneath what little armour common soldiers could afford, nothing at all standing between a body and a Wessex winter. A little further along the muddy track that connects Ceolwulf's farmstead to the small settlement nearby, smoke is rising from a second structure, smaller than the family's hall, but built along similar lines, and from inside it comes a rhythmic clanging that carries clearly through the cold morning air. This is where the local smith works, a man named Beorhtric, and this early hour is exactly when smithing work needs to happen, because the forge fire, once properly built up, is wasteful to let sit unused, and because certain repairs, the mending of a broken plough blade, the reshaping of a bent scythe, cannot wait for a more convenient hour when a farmer needs his tool back before the next field is due for turning. Beorhtric is not a wealthy man by any measure that would register centuries later, but within this small community he holds a kind of quiet importance that outstrips his modest holdings, because a community without a smith is a community that cannot repair its own tools, cannot shoe its horses, cannot produce the iron fittings that hold a plough together, or the nails that hold a door frame together, or, in a harder year, the blades that a household might need for defence in a year like this one, when defence is no longer a hypothetical concern. His forge is a low structure with one open side facing away from the prevailing wind, a stone hearth built up with clay, a bellows worked by a leather bag and wooden handles that his apprentice, a boy of perhaps 12 who is not his son but the son of a neighbouring family sent to learn the trade, pumps in a steady rhythm that keeps the coals glowing at the fierce heat iron working requires. The sound of hammer on iron carries a good distance in the still morning air, a sound that everyone in this small community has grown so accustomed to that they would notice its absence far more than its presence, the way you notice a clock stop rather than a clock ticking. Beorhtric is currently working on something that has nothing to do with farming at all, and it is worth pausing here because this detail says something about the wider anxiety hanging over the entire region this particular winter. He is repairing a spearhead, its socket cracked from an old strike, brought to him by a man from 2 farms over, who has decided, in light of everything happening this year, that it might be worth having a working spear in the house again, even though he has not needed one in a decade of relatively peaceful farming life. This is the quiet, unglamorous texture of what a Viking incursion actually does to a landscape like this one. It does not necessarily mean armies clashing outside your door. More often it means exactly this: ordinary tools of defence being pulled out of storage and dusted off, old skills half remembered and freshly practised, a low current of readiness running beneath the surface of otherwise unremarkable days. From somewhere past the smithy, faint but carrying, comes the sound of a handbell, rung by the local priest, a man named Ceolwulf, who serves the small wooden church that sits at the centre of this scattered settlement, a building not much larger than Ceolwulf's own hall, its walls timber rather than the stone that grander churches in larger towns might have, its interior simple, a single room with a modest altar and walls that have, over the years, been decorated with paintings whose colours have faded to soft ochres and blues from years of candle smoke. The bell is not calling anyone to a formal service at this hour. It is simply the priest's habit, a way of marking the day's turning, and those within earshot who hear it barely register it consciously anymore, the way you might stop noticing a familiar clock. But it does something else too, something worth mentioning, because in a year like this one, the sound of that bell carries a small, wordless reassurance. It means the church is still standing. It means the priest is still there, still keeping to his routines, and in a world without newspapers or messengers arriving daily with updates, small consistent sounds like a church bell become a kind of quiet proof that the world has not yet fully come apart. Christianity by this point sits deep in the bones of Wessex, though it wears a slightly different shape than later centuries would recognise. Ceolwulf is not a highly educated man by the standards of the great monasteries. some of which ironically have themselves been targets of Viking raids precisely because monastic wealth, chalices and reliquaries and illuminated manuscripts made such tempting and poorly defended targets. He knows his prayers, knows the rhythm of the church calendar, can read enough Latin to get through the necessary rites, and beyond that, much of his authority in this community comes not from scholarship but from simple presence, from being the person who baptizes the babies, who buries the dead, who is expected to have something steadying to say when a 14-year-old boy goes missing looking for news of the king. He does in fact have something to say about exactly that, because Athilgifu, unable to fully settle into her spinning this particular morning, has walked the short distance to the church, ostensibly to light a candle, though everyone including Cinewulf understands this is really about Wulfstan. The church interior is dim and cool, smelling of beeswax and old wood, and the particular mustiness of a building that gets damp in winter, despite everyone's best efforts. A few candles burn near the altar, tallow rather than the more expensive beeswax for most of them, though there are one or two proper beeswax candles reserved for feast days and important occasions, their light noticeably cleaner and less smoky than the tallow ones. Cinewulf does not offer false comfort. This is worth noting, because it would be easy to imagine this scene sliding into something saccharine, a priest offering easy platitudes about faith solving everything. Instead, he simply sits with Athilgifu for a few minutes near the altar, says a short prayer that names Wulfstan specifically, and tells her, in the plain way of a man who has buried enough neighbours to know better than to promise outcomes he cannot guarantee, that the boy is young and quick and knows this land better than most grown men from other shires, and that this counts for something. It is not much, but Athilgifu leaves feeling a fraction lighter than when she arrived, which is, in the end, most of what any of us can offer each other in moments like this one. Let us drift now toward a different corner of this same world, because Wessex in 878 is not only farmers and smiths and a hidden king. There is a noblewoman whose life runs on an entirely different rhythm, and her name is Ealhswith, and she happens, in fact, to be married to the very king currently hiding in the marshes. Ealhswith herself is not at Athelney this particular winter. For her own safety and for the safety of the royal children, she has been moved, along with several of the younger ones, to a location further from the immediate danger, likely staying under the protection of trusted kin or allied nobility. The precise details of royal movements during this chaotic stretch being one of the many things that history has left frustratingly incomplete. What we do know is that Ealhswith comes from a notable Mercian family herself, that she is by all surviving accounts a woman of real capability, and that a queen's life in this era, even in ordinary circumstances, is nothing like the leisure one might imagine when picturing royalty. A noblewoman of Ealhswith's rank oversees an enormous domestic operation, one that in some ways is not so different in kind from what Athilgifu manages, only vastly larger in scale. Where Athilgifu answers for one household of perhaps 5 people plus livestock, a queen or a high-ranking noblewoman answers, in practice, for the running of an entire royal household wherever it happens to be residing, which in this period moves seasonally between different royal estates, since a king's court does not stay fixed in one palace the way later monarchs' courts will. Food stores for dozens or even hundreds of people, the management of servants and enslaved labourers who handle the heaviest domestic labour, the production of textiles on a scale far beyond a single family's needs, because a royal household must clothe not just its immediate family but its retinue, must produce fine garments suitable for the display of status, must maintain stores of cloth that can be given as gifts to cement alliances, since gift-giving in this world is not a courtesy but a political instrument. There is a particular kind of loneliness available to a woman in Ealhswith's position this winter that Athilgifu, for all her very real fear, does not share in quite the same way. Athilgifu at least knows more or less where her husband is, can picture the fields he is walking. Ealhswith, separated from Alfred by both distance and by the deliberate secrecy surrounding his exact movements, must manage an entire household's worth of responsibility, while truly uncertain whether the man she married, the father of her children, the king whose survival her own children's futures depend on, is even still alive. This is not usually the version of this story that gets told. The version most people know centres entirely on Alfred, on the marshes, on the burned cakes, and Alswith becomes, if she appears at all, a background detail. But somewhere in this same kingdom, on this same morning, she is very likely doing something quietly extraordinary too, which is simply continuing to run a household, to reassure frightened children, to make decisions about stores and safety and loyalty among the nobles around her, all while carrying a private terror she likely allows almost no one to see. Back at the farmstead, the day has settled into its working rhythm, and there is a comfort in watching ordinary labour continue underneath extraordinary circumstances. Ceolwulf has moved from the sheep to a task that will take up most of his afternoon, mending a section of fencing along the eastern boundary of his land, wattle panels woven from hazel that have sagged and partly rotted after a wet autumn. This is not glamorous work. It is the kind of repetitive, physical labour that fills the vast majority of a farmer's year, far more so than the dramatic moments history tends to remember, and there is something almost meditative in watching him work, weaving new hazel rods between the upright stakes, testing each section's give with the flat of his hand before moving to the next. It is while he is doing this that a neighbour approaches along the boundary path, a man named Osgar who farms the adjoining strip of land, and the two men fall into the kind of conversation that happens between people who have known each other their whole lives, a conversation with long pauses in it, comfortable silences that do not need to be filled. Osgar has heard something, second-hand from a cousin who trades regularly at a larger market settlement, that the king has sent word out for the fyrd to gather, and though the exact details Osgar has heard are garbled, a place name mangled, a date uncertain, the core of it lines up with what we now know actually happened. Alfred was, at this very point in the historical record, quietly assembling the muster that would gather in a matter of weeks at a place called Egbert's Stone, on the edge of a great forest, drawing together the free men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and part of Hampshire in numbers larger than anyone expected, because word had apparently spread further and faster through the countryside than the scattered, demoralised nobility had dared to hope. Ceolwulf listens to this with the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic in his head that he does not want to say aloud, because if the fyrd is truly gathering, he himself may well be called again, a third time this year, and a third calling means a third stretch of days or weeks away from a farm that really cannot spare the labour much longer without real consequences for how the family eats come the following winter. This tension between the demands of kingship and the demands of survival at the household level sits at the very heart of what it meant to be a free man in Alfred's Wessex. The fyrd was not a standing army. It was, essentially, the kingdom's farmers, summoned as needed, expected to arrive with their own weapons, their own provisions for a limited period, and expected then to go home again, because a kingdom that kept its entire agricultural workforce permanently under arms would simply starve. Alfred, in the years following this crisis, will eventually restructure this system, dividing the fyrd so that only a portion serves at any given time, while the rest remain home to work the land. A reform born directly out of painful lessons learned in years exactly like this one. But that reform is still in the future. Right now, in 878, the old system still strains under exactly the kind of pressure Ceolwulf is feeling standing at his half-mended fence. Osgar eventually moves on, back toward his own fields, and Ceolwulf finishes the section of fencing he started, working a little faster now, a little more urgently, as if finishing the task might somehow buy him a few more uninterrupted days before whatever comes next arrives. The afternoon light shifts, that particular slanted gold that comes in the hours before an early winter sunset, and back at the house, Aethelgifu has moved from spinning to the preparation of the evening meal, a task that in this household, as in most of this era, takes considerably longer than the meal itself will take to eat. There is no refrigeration, obviously. So much of the daily cooking work involves managing food that has been preserved through methods that require ongoing attention. A portion of salted pork hangs in the smoke above one corner of the hearth, slowly curing, and Aethelgifu cuts a piece from it for tonight's pottage, a thick stew that forms the backbone of most evening meals across this entire social class, built from whatever combination of grains, dried peas or beans, root vegetables, and small amounts of meat happen to be available that week. She has parsnips today, along with a handful of dried peas soaked since morning, and these go into the same iron pot that held the morning's porridge, cleaned but not scoured spotless, because a little residual flavour from previous meals is not considered a flaw in this kind of cooking. It is simply how the pot works, developing a kind of accumulated depth of flavour over months and years of continuous use that a modern cook obsessed with clean starts might find strange, but that Aethelgifu would consider entirely unremarkable, simply how a cooking pot is supposed to behave. The fire needs tending throughout this process, needs to be kept at a steady simmer rather than a rolling boil, and this requires the kind of attentive, low-grade labour that fills so much of a woman's day in this world, never quite finished with any single task, always half attending to 3 or 4 things running in parallel: the fire, the pot, Adjith's whereabouts, the mental tally of what stores remain and what will need replenishing before spring. There is something Aethelgifu has not told Ceolwulf, and I want to sit with this for a moment, because it is the kind of small private thing that rarely makes it into any history book, but that shapes, quietly and completely, how a person moves through an ordinary day. 2 nights before Wulfstan left, mother and son argued sharply, in a way they rarely did, because Aethelgifu had refused outright to let him go, and Wulfstan, 14 and certain of his own readiness for the world in the particular way 14-year-olds have always been certain of such things, had said something in the heat of it that he most likely did not mean, something about wishing he had a mother less afraid of everything. He left 3 days later anyway, slipping out at dawn with the other boys before Aethelgifu had fully forgiven him, and she has not told anyone, not even Ceolwulf, that the last real conversation she had with her son was an argument that if something has happened to him out there in the uncertain world beyond their fields, the final thing she said to him in anger was not the thing she would have chosen to leave him with. This is the kind of guilt that has no obvious remedy. She cannot take it back. She cannot know, until he walks back through that door, whether she will get the chance to soften it into something gentler. So she carries it privately, folded into the rhythm of stirring a pot that does not need constant stirring, into the careful evenness of her breathing when Ceolwulf asks, gently, whether she is all right, into the small extra tenderness she shows Edgith this week, as if loving one child more visibly might somehow balance an old debt owed to the other. I find this detail worth lingering on, not because it resolves into anything neat, but because it does not. Aethelgifu will likely never mention this argument to anyone. It will simply live inside her, the way so much of what people actually feel in any era tends to live unrecorded, unspoken, folded quietly into the ordinary motions of an ordinary evening. Let us step outside again, because the light is fading now, and there is something happening on the wider stage of this kingdom that deserves a few minutes of your attention before we return to this family for the night. Alfred's reign, even before this crisis, even before the marshes and the burned cakes and the desperate gathering of a scattered fard, had already been shaped by an idea that historians still consider genuinely ahead of its time, though Alfred himself would not have used language like that. He believed, with an intensity that seems to have been entirely sincere, that a kingdom's real strength lay not only in its warriors but in its learning, and in the years both before and after this particular crisis, he pursued this belief with a stubbornness that eventually reshaped how an entire generation of Wessex nobility understood what it meant to be educated. Before the Viking assault that scattered his kingdom this winter, Alfred had already begun gathering scholars to his court, men brought in from Mercia, from Wales, eventually from as far as the continent, tasked with a project that Alfred considered essential and that many of his contemporaries likely found strange, translating important Latin texts into the English language itself, so that knowledge previously locked away behind a language only clergy and the highly educated could read, might become available to ordinary noble sons, to future administrators, to anyone with the wit to read but not necessarily the years of formal Latin schooling that had previously gate-kept nearly all written knowledge. This project, interrupted now by the sheer emergency of survival, will resume once the kingdom stabilizes and some of the texts that emerge from it, Translations Alfred himself is said to have personally worked on in later calmer years will become foundational documents for how English as a written language develops over the following centuries. It is a strange thing to consider, sitting here in the cold uncertainty of 878, that the man currently hiding in a swamp, worrying about burned cakes and scattered loyalty, will one day be remembered as much for books as for battles. There is another detail about Alfred worth knowing, something that reveals a different side of him entirely. He suffered, as I mentioned earlier, from a chronic illness that plagued him from a young age, and according to accounts written later in his life, he made a private vow as a young man, praying for an affliction that would be painful but would not visibly disable him, would not prevent him from fulfilling his duties as a leader, because he feared leprosy above nearly everything else, a disease that in this era carried both physical devastation and profound social exile. Whatever the precise nature of his actual illness, and modern historians deeply disagree on this, the story itself tells us something true about the man, a leader living with private, ongoing physical suffering that he worked constantly to keep hidden from the people who depended on his strength. This is worth sitting with, I think, this idea of a king managing his own body's betrayal in secret, while simultaneously managing a kingdom's collapse in public. There is something quietly moving in it, a kind of parallel to Aethelgifu's own hidden burden, a reminder that history's grandest figures were carrying private weights of their own, invisible to the people around them, exactly the way ordinary people were. Evening settles properly over Ceolwulf's farmstead now, the sky gone the deep blue-grey that comes just before true dark, and the family gathers again around the hearth for the pottage that has been simmering most of the afternoon. There is a particular ritual to this meal that repeats nightly, unremarkable to the family themselves, but worth noticing from the outside. Ceolwulf eats first, not from any formal rule, but from simple habit. The head of household served first as a matter of course, though the portions themselves are roughly equal. Nobody in this household eating dramatically more or less than anyone else, because there is not enough surplus for that kind of hierarchy to express itself through quantity, the way it might in a wealthier home. The stew is thick, filling, faintly earthy from the parsnips, and it is eaten with the last of the barley bread, torn and used almost like a spoon at times, useful for scraping the sides of a wooden bowl clean. There is little conversation during the meal itself, eating being treated as its own kind of task requiring its own kind of attention, though Egypt breaks the quiet periodically with observations about her day, about the hen, about a cloud shaped like a boat she saw that afternoon, and nobody hushes her, her small chatter, a kind of gift the rest of the family seems to unconsciously understand they need tonight. And then, just as the meal winds down, just as Aethelgifu is gathering the bowls to set them aside for washing come morning, there is a sound at the door. Not a knock exactly, more a scrape and a fumble, the sound of someone too tired to manage the latch smoothly, and every head in the room turns at once. It is Wulfstan. He looks, in the firelight, older than he did 3 days ago, which is impossible in any literal sense but true in every sense that matters. His cloak is mud spattered to the knee. There is a scrape along one cheekbone that has scabbed over, minor, the kind of injury a 14-year-old boy collects without particularly noticing at the time. He is exhausted in the specific, hollow way of someone who has walked further than his body was quite ready for, and for a moment he simply stands in the doorway, blinking against the firelight after the dark outside, and nobody moves. Then Aethelgifu is across the room, and whatever she says to him, whatever mix of relief and residual anger and pure animal need to touch her child and confirm he is real, gets said too fast and too quiet for us to fully catch, and Wulfstan, for all his 14-year-old certainty about the world, does not resist being held the way a slightly older boy might have. He has news once he has eaten, once he has been fussed over and settled by the fire with a blanket that Edgith insists on tucking around him, despite his protests that he is not a baby. The rumours were true, more or less. The king is alive, the king is at Athelney, and word is indeed going out for the Fyrd to gather, though Wulfstan and his companions were sensible enough, or perhaps simply frightened enough, to turn back before actually reaching anywhere close to the marshes themselves, settling instead for second-hand information gathered from other travellers on the road, which is, all things considered, exactly the kind of pragmatic caution a mother would have insisted on if she had been asked, which she was not, and which she will surely mention at some later point when the immediate relief of his return has worn off enough to make room for renewed irritation. But for tonight, none of that matters. For tonight, the boy is home, safe, eating a second helping of stew that Aethelgifu insists on despite his claim that he is not particularly hungry, and the small hall feels, for the first time in 3 days, like it has all its proper pieces back in place. This is a good moment to pause here, to let this family settle into their evening, and to widen our view again, because there is a great deal more of this world worth understanding, and the deeper hours of the night are the right time to move through it slowly. Wessex under Alfred, even in this moment of crisis, is not a simple or primitive place, and it is worth correcting an impression that popular imagination sometimes carries about this era, an assumption that Anglo-Saxon England, before the Norman conquest, was somehow a crude or unsophisticated society waiting to be civilized by later arrivals. This is simply not accurate. Wessex has functioning courts of law. It has a system of shires and hundreds, administrative divisions that organize taxation, justice, and military obligation across the kingdom in ways that will in fact survive in recognizable form for many centuries afterward, long past the point when Wessex itself ceases to exist as an independent kingdom. It has trade networks reaching across the sea to the continent, bringing in goods like wine, glass, and fine metalwork in exchange for wool, for tin, for the agricultural surplus of exactly the kind of farms Ceolwulf and his neighbours work. Alfred, once this immediate crisis resolves, will formalise much of this administrative structure further, issuing a law code that draws together and updates the legal traditions of earlier Wessex kings, explicitly framing his own laws as continuous with a longer inherited tradition rather than as some entirely new invention. He is, in this sense, as much a preserver as an innovator, someone who understood that a kingdom's stability depends partly on people believing their institutions have deep roots, even while he was, in fact, quietly reshaping a great deal of what those institutions actually did. There is one particular innovation, still several years from full realization at this exact point in 878, but already taking shape in Alfred's thinking, that deserves real attention, because it will end up reshaping the physical landscape of England for centuries. It is the system of fortified settlements that later generations will call burhs, a network of defended towns spaced across the kingdom at roughly a day's march from one another, each designed so that no farmstead in Wessex would sit more than about 20 miles from a place of refuge with proper walls and a garrison capable of holding against a raiding force. This idea, born directly out of the painful lessons of exactly this winter, out of watching how quickly and how devastatingly a mobile Viking force could strike an undefended kingdom, will eventually transform dozens of small settlements into genuine fortified towns, their earthen ramparts and wooden palisades laid out according to careful planning, their internal street grids in several cases surprisingly regular, organized to allow the rapid movement of defenders to any point along the walls. Some of these burhs, places that in 878 are barely more than a scattering of farms or a minor royal estate, will grow within a generation or two into genuine urban centres, market towns whose basic layout, remarkably, still shapes the street patterns of several English towns that exist to this day. I find this detail worth sitting with for a moment, the way a crisis this immediate, this frightening, this personal to families like Ceolwulf's, will end up seeding something that outlives Alfred himself by 1,000 years and more. He could not have known, hiding in that marsh, listening to reports from trusted men, worrying over illness he kept carefully hidden, that the defensive network taking shape in his mind during the worst months of his reign would still be quietly shaping the geography of England, long after every person in this story, every person listening to this story tonight, has become nothing more than a name in a record somewhere, if that. Let us move forward now, gently through the following weeks, because though tonight's story lives mostly in this one particular moment, in 878, in this specific winter of uncertainty, it is worth knowing, softly, without dwelling on violence, how this particular chapter of the larger story resolves. In the weeks following this night, the fyrd that Alfred quietly summoned does indeed gather at Egbert's stone, and the numbers that arrive apparently exceed what Alfred himself expected, farmers and freemen from 3 shires converging on a wooded meeting point, having decided, in numbers large enough to matter, that a scattered and battered king was still worth rallying behind. From there, this newly assembled force moves to confront Guthrum's army, and near a place called Eddington, a battle takes place that will become one of the turning points of English history. I will not linger on the details of that day, because tonight is not the night for that, and because the purpose of this story has never been the clash of shields, but the quiet lives lived around and beneath such moments. What matters for our purposes is simply this: Alfred's forces win, decisively enough that Guthrum's army is forced to retreat and eventually to surrender, and what follows that surrender is, in its own way, almost as remarkable as the battle itself. Rather than simply crushing his defeated enemy, which would have been entirely within the norms of the era, Alfred instead negotiates a treaty, and as part of that treaty, Guthrum agrees to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather in the ceremony that follows, a gesture that functions simultaneously as religious conversion and as political theatre, binding a former enemy into a new kind of relationship built on ritual kinship rather than pure conquest. The kingdom is effectively divided, with Guthrum and his followers settling in the eastern regions that will come to be known as the Danelaw, while Alfred retains and in time expands his authority across Wessex and eventually beyond it. Ceolwulf's family, on this particular quiet night in their farmstead, knows none of this yet, of course. They only know that Wulfstan is home, that the stew was good, that the fire is burning low and needs one more log before everyone settles for the night. But there is something worth noticing in the gap between what this family can see from where they sit and what we, looking back across more than 1,000 years, can see laid out in full. They are living, without knowing it, inside one of the genuine turning points of their kingdom's history, and they will go to sleep tonight the same way they have gone to sleep every other night this winter, with worry, with hope, with the ordinary exhaustion of a day's labour, entirely unaware that the world on the other side of this particular darkness is about to change. Bedtime in a household like this one is a slow, layered process, not a single decisive act, but a series of small closings down, one after another, the whole house gradually settling the way embers settle into ash. Edith is the first to properly fade, her earlier chatter thinning into shorter and shorter sentences until she simply stops mid-conversation and has to be gently roused enough to make her own way behind the willow partition, rather than falling asleep sitting upright against her mother's side, which she has done more than once, and which always makes for an awkward business of carrying a half-asleep child to bed without fully waking her. Wulfstan, despite his exhaustion, resists sleep a little longer, the particular stubbornness of a boy who has just had an adventure and does not want the day to end with him simply going unconscious like anyone else. But even his resistance has limits, and within a short while he too has retreated behind the partition, and his breathing, when Aethelgifu checks on him a few minutes later under the pretense of adjusting his blanket, has already gone slow and even. Ceolwulf banks the fire for the night, a careful process of arranging the remaining coals and covering them partially with ash, in a way that will keep a low, contained heat through the night hours, without the fire fully dying, so that come morning there will be embers still alive enough to build back up into a proper flame, rather than having to start entirely from cold flint and tinder, a task nobody particularly enjoys on a frozen morning. This banking of the fire is its own small nightly ritual, performed with a kind of unconscious precision built from thousands of repetitions, and there is something almost tender in watching a man who has spent his whole day worrying about kings and fyrds and the safety of his son perform this small, careful, domestic task with such quiet attention, as if the fate of tomorrow's warmth mattered every bit as much as the fate of the kingdom, which, in the narrow scope of one family's life, it remarkably does. The dog has been let in tonight, an unspoken concession to the general emotional weight of the evening, and it settles near the banked fire with a heavy, contented sigh, and Athelgifu, moving around the darkened room by feel more than sight now, checks that the door bar is properly seated, checks the small window opening covered with a stretched, oiled animal hide that lets in a little diffuse light during the day and keeps out at least some of the cold at night, and finally settles herself onto the low bed she shares with Ceolwulf, a simple wooden frame strung with rope and topped with a straw-filled mattress, covered with the same kind of woolen blankets that clothe the rest of the household, layered thick enough against a winter that has, everyone quietly hopes, not yet shown its very worst. There is a particular quality to the darkness inside a house like this one at night, worth noticing before we drift onward. It is not the absolute darkness of a modern room with curtains drawn against streetlight, because there is always some faint glow from the banked coals, a dim orange presence at the edge of vision that never fully vanishes, and there is the darkness itself, which is not empty but textured, full of small sounds, the settling of the thatch roof as it cools, the occasional shift and stamp of livestock at the far end of the hall, the wind finding whatever small gaps the daubed walls have not quite sealed. Aethelgifu lies awake a little longer than Ceolwulf, listening to this particular darkness, to the specific fact of her son's breathing somewhere behind the partition, close enough to hear, close enough to be real in a way that mere hope could not have made him 3 hours earlier. She thinks, before sleep finally takes her, that she will tell him tomorrow that she is not actually angry anymore, that whatever was said in the heat of an argument days ago does not need to be the last word between them, and this small private resolution, this quiet decision made in the dark where nobody else can hear it, settles something in her chest that has been unsettled for days. She sleeps. Let us leave this house now, gently, and let some weeks pass, because there is more of this world worth seeing, and spring, when it comes, brings with it a different texture of life entirely, one worth spending time inside of before this long night's story finally comes to its own quiet close. By the time the frost properly lifts from the ground, word has spread through Wessex of what happened at Eddington, and the mood across the countryside has shifted in a way that even ordinary farmers, focused as they mostly are on their own fields and their own households, cannot help but feel. There is a loosening in the air that has nothing to do with the weather, a sense, cautious and not yet fully trusted, that the immediate danger has passed, that a king who seemed finished in January has instead proven himself in a way that will echo for generations. Spring, in this world, means an enormous surge of activity after the relative stillness of winter, and it is worth spending some time inside this seasonal shift, because it touches every part of the society we have been moving through tonight. The fields that sat dark and fallow through the winter months now demand nearly every waking hour of a farming household's attention. Ceolwulf is out before proper light most mornings now, guiding a plough pulled by a pair of oxen borrowed jointly with 2 neighbouring households, an arrangement common across much of Wessex, since a single farmstead like his own rarely owns enough draft animals outright to manage ploughing alone, and cooperation of exactly this kind, informal, built on long-standing mutual obligation rather than any written contract, forms much of the actual social glue holding small rural communities together. This particular plough is a heavy wooden implement tipped with an iron share that Beorhtric the smith mended and sharpened just weeks earlier, and guiding it through heavy clay soil is exhausting, full-body work, requiring Ceolwulf to walk behind it for hours, correcting its angle, calling to the oxen in the particular low, steady voice that working animals respond to best, while Wulfstan, old enough now to take on real responsibility, walks ahead scattering seed by hand from a woven basket slung at his hip, broadcasting it across the freshly turned earth in a steady, practiced rhythm. There is a kind of music to this labour, if you let yourself hear it that way, the creak of the plough harness, the heavy rhythmic breathing of the oxen, the soft repeated scatter of seed hitting turned soil, birds already circling with interest at the disturbed ground, hoping for an easy meal despite Wulfstan's occasional shout to scare them off. It is not romantic labour in the moment it is being performed. It is hard on the back and harder on the hands, but there is something in its rhythm that connects this single morning to countless other spring mornings, stretching backward through generations of families working this same stretch of land, and forward, too, into springs none of this family will live to see. Meanwhile, A short distance away, in the growing settlement that surrounds the church where Cynewulf serves, something is happening that would have seemed almost unimaginable just months earlier. Word has come down through Aethelnoth's administration that this particular settlement has been selected as a site for one of the new fortified burhs Alfred is beginning to establish in earnest now that the immediate crisis has passed and the ordinary rhythms of village life have been disrupted, productively this time, by an influx of activity connected to this designation. Men from across the district, some sent as part of obligations tied to their land holdings. A system that will eventually be formalized into something historians call the Burgal Hiddage, a detailed accounting of exactly how many hides of land, a hide being a unit tied to the amount of land considered sufficient to support one household, are assigned to the maintenance and defense of each fortified site, arrive to help dig the defensive ditch and raise the earthen rampart that will eventually be topped with a timber palisade. This is enormous, coordinated labor, organized at a scale well beyond anything a single household or even a single village could manage alone, and it represents something authentically new taking shape in Wessex, a kingdom learning, in real time, out of hard experience, how to organize itself for a kind of collective defense it had never quite needed in this particular form before. Ceolwulf, once the spring planting is sufficiently underway, will himself owe a portion of labor toward this project. A handful of days spent digging alongside men from farms he has never visited, under the direction of an overseer appointed by Aethelnoth, and though this labor obligation is not something he particularly welcomes, arriving as it does during an already demanding season, there is, underneath the grumbling, a kind of grim satisfaction in it too, a sense of participating in something that might actually mean his own family sleeps a little easier come the next time raiders test the borders of this kingdom. Let us walk, for a little while, into the settlement itself on a market day, because this is worth seeing clearly. This is where the scattered threads of this world, the farmers and the smiths and the weavers and the travelling traders, all briefly gather in one place, and the texture of it is unlike anything we have shown you so far tonight. Market day in a settlement of this size is not the sprawling affair you might picture from a larger town, nothing like what happens in Winchester or in the trading centres along the coast, but for a rural community like this one, it is still the closest thing to spectacle that ordinary life regularly offers. A cleared patch of ground near the church fills, from early morning, with a loose scatter of small stalls and blankets spread on the ground, local farmers offering surplus produce, eggs, a few late-season apples kept through winter storage, cheese wrapped in cloth, alongside travelling traders who have made the journey from further afield carrying goods that no local household could produce for itself. There is a man selling salt, an essential commodity that not every inland farm can easily access, brought from coastal salt works where seawater is evaporated in shallow pans, and salt in this world functions almost like a secondary currency, valuable enough that households guard their stores carefully, since preserving meat and fish through the winter depends entirely on having enough of it on hand. There is another trader offering small quantities of spices, pepper most likely, carried along trade routes that stretch, link by link, hand by hand, back toward the Mediterranean and beyond, a reminder that even a kingdom as embattled and locally focused as Alfred's Wessex remains connected, however thinly, to a much wider world of exchange. Beorhtric has a small stall of his own today, offering simple iron goods, nails, small tools, a few finished knife blades, alongside his ongoing repair work. And there is a woman a few stalls down selling pottery, sturdy greyware vessels thrown on a simple turntable and fired in a pit kiln dug into a nearby hillside, her hands stained with the particular grey dust of her trade, her wares ranging from small cups to larger storage jars, capable of holding a season's worth of preserved grain. A Thilgifu has come with a length of woven cloth to trade, wool dyed the deep reddish brown that madder root produces when the wool is properly mordanted first, and she trades it for a small quantity of the salt she has been running low on, and a handful of dried figs, an imported treat that Edgith, trailing close at her mother's side, eyes with the particular focused longing that children bring to rare sweetness. There is gossip moving through this market, the way gossip always moves through any gathering of people who do not otherwise see each other daily. News of the treaty with Guthrum, embellished and reshaped with each retelling the way all such news eventually is. Speculation about what the arrival of a new burh might mean for the settlement's future, whether it might grow into something larger, whether traders might start coming through more regularly once the defences are properly established. There is also, threaded through all of this practical exchange, the ordinary social business of a small community. Marriages being quietly negotiated between families, a dispute over a boundary stone being aired in the hope that enough witnesses present might shame the parties into a fair resolution without needing to escalate to a formal hearing before the local reeves. It is loud here, in a way that Ceolwulf's quiet farmstead rarely is, dogs weaving between legs, chickens in wicker cages squawking their displeasure, the low constant murmur of dozens of overlapping conversations, and there is something honestly restorative in it after a long isolated winter, a reminder that this small household is not in fact alone in the world, that it exists within a wider web of neighbours and trade and shared obligation that has quietly held this whole society together through a crisis that might easily have shattered it. Let us drift now toward a different kind of gathering place entirely, because not everyone in this kingdom spends their days working land or trading goods, and there is a corner of this world worth visiting before the night grows too much later, a monastery some distance from where our family lives, where a very different kind of daily rhythm unfolds. The monastery sits some distance from the market settlement, its buildings arranged around a central open yard in the traditional pattern, timber built like nearly everything else in this era, though its church is somewhat grander than the simple structure where Ceolwulf serves, its walls at least partly built of stone brought at considerable effort and expense from a quarry some miles distant, a mark of the resources the church, even in a period of upheaval, could still command when it chose to. Inside, in a small room set aside for the purpose, a handful of monks work at the slow, exacting labour of copying manuscripts, and this is worth understanding properly, because it is easy, from a distance of more than 1,000 years, to underestimate just how laborious this process actually was. Each page of parchment, made from carefully prepared and scraped animal skin, usually calf or sheep, represents hours of preparatory work before a single word is even written. The ink itself is mixed by hand from ingredients like oak galls, a growth caused by wasp larvae on oak trees, combined with iron salts and a binding agent, producing a dark liquid that will, if properly prepared, remain legible for centuries. A monk copying a text works slowly, deliberately, dipping a quill cut from a goose feather, comparing each line against the source text laid open beside him, and a single substantial manuscript might take a skilled copyist many months of steady, patient labour to complete. Mistakes are corrected by carefully scraping the parchment surface with a small blade, and entire pages might need to be discarded and restarted if an error proves too significant to fix cleanly, representing not just wasted time but wasted material, since parchment itself is expensive, an entire calf or sheepskin yielding only a handful of usable pages. This is precisely the kind of institution, and precisely the kind of patient, exacting labour that Alfred's translation project depends upon entirely. Somewhere, in a monastery not unlike this one, scholars are working, some of them brought from considerable distances specifically because Alfred sought them out, translating texts he considered essential, works of history, of philosophy, of practical guidance for governance and for pastoral care, rendering them from Latin into the English spoken by ordinary people, a project that reflects something properly unusual about how this particular king thought about power and legitimacy. Alfred seems to have believed with real conviction that a kingdom's long-term strength depended on more than armies and fortifications, that wisdom itself, made accessible beyond the narrow circle of Latin-trained clergy, was a form of defense in its own right, a way of ensuring that future generations of leaders, judges and administrators would have the tools to govern wisely even after his own reign ended. It is a strikingly modern instinct, in some ways, this belief that education is infrastructure, and it is worth remembering that it was forming, quietly, alongside all the desperate military and administrative work of surviving this particular crisis. There is a specific object connected to Alfred that has survived, remarkably, across more than 11 centuries, and though it will not actually be crafted for a few more years yet from this particular winter, I want to mention it here because it captures something of this same instinct so precisely. It is a small, exquisite piece of goldwork, teardrop-shaped, set with rock crystal over an enamelled image of a man holding what appear to be floriated sceptres, and around its edge runs an inscription in Old English stating plainly that Alfred ordered it made, discovered centuries later, in 1693, buried in the same marshy Somerset ground not far from where Athelney itself once stood. This object, now known simply as the Alfred jewel, is widely believed to have served as the handle for a pointer, a tool used to follow along lines of text while reading, precisely the kind of practical object a king obsessed with literacy and translation might commission and distribute to bishops and monasteries as a gift, a small, beautiful, deeply personal artifact connecting a king's private conviction about the value of learning to an object you could, quite literally, hold in your hand and run along a line of text. I find this detail worth sitting with, this simple truth that out of everything Alfred built and defended and fought for, one of the objects that survives most vividly into our own time is not a sword or a crown, but something connected, quite directly, to the act of reading. Let us turn now toward a different kind of gathering, because it would be incomplete to spend this whole night among farmers and monks without also stepping briefly into the hall of a nobleman, since the texture of a feast in this world reveals things about status and hospitality that are worth understanding. Aethelnoth, the ealdorman we met earlier reporting to Alfred at Athelney, maintains his own hall some distance from our farming family, a structure considerably grander than Sheolwulf's home, though built along fundamentally similar lines, timber-framed, thatch-roofed, though longer, with a raised platform at one end, where the ealdorman and his most honoured guests sit during formal occasions. In the weeks following the treaty with Guthrum, once the immediate danger has passed and something like normal life begins reasserting itself, Aethelnoth hosts a feast, partly to celebrate the resolution of the crisis, and partly, as is always true of noble feasts in this era, to reinforce bonds of loyalty among the lesser lords and prominent freemen of his district, hospitality functioning here as a genuine political tool rather than mere entertainment. The hall on the night of this feast is transformed by firelight and candlelight into something warmer and more theatrical than its everyday self. Long trestle tables set up along the length of the room, benches crowded with guests ranging from minor nobility down to a handful of prosperous freemen, invited as a mark of particular favour, men whose loyalty during the recent crisis has been noted and is now being quietly rewarded with proximity to power, even if only for the space of a single evening. Food at this feast reflects both the season and the status of the household hosting it. There is roasted meat in genuine quantity, something rare in most households through much of the year, pork and mutton, seasoned with imported spices that only a household of real means could afford regularly, and there is white wheat bread, rather than the dense barley and rye loaves that make up most common households' daily fare, a small but meaningful marker of status, since wheat requires better soil and more careful cultivation than the hardier grains most farmers rely on. There is mead as well as ale, brewed from honey rather than grain, sweeter and considerably more expensive to produce given how much honey a proper batch requires, and it is served in horn cups and, for the most honoured guests, in vessels of actual glass, imported from the continent at real expense, their pale greenish tint and slightly imperfect, bubbled surface marking them as luxury goods that most people in this kingdom will never once hold in their own hands. A poet performs partway through the evening, reciting verse in the alliterative, rhythmic style native to Old English poetry, a form built not on rhyme but on stressed syllables and repeated consonant sounds carrying across each line. And though we will not reproduce his actual words here, it is worth understanding what this performance meant to the people listening to it. Poetry in this culture is not merely entertainment, it is memory made portable, a way of preserving history and values, and the deeds of notable men in a form durable enough to survive being carried only in human minds, recited from memory across generations, since so few people beyond the clergy could actually read. This particular poet, on this particular night, recites verses touching on loyalty, on the virtue of a lord who protects his people, and though nobody names Alfred outright, everybody in that hall understands exactly who is being honoured by these words, exactly what recent events have made this kind of verse feel newly, urgently relevant, rather than merely traditional. There is something worth noticing in the contrast between this feast and the quiet evening we spent earlier in Ceolwulf's farmstead. The scale is different, the abundance is different, but underneath both scenes runs something remarkably similar, a household drawing its people close after a period of genuine fear, marking survival with warmth and shared food, and the simple ancient comfort of many people gathered safely under one roof. Status changes the decoration. It does not change the underlying human need being served. Let us return now to Ceolwulf's family, and let the season turn further, because summer in this world carries its own particular weight, its own particular rhythm, and it is worth moving slowly through it before we arrive at the harvest that will in the end determine whether this family's winter is comfortable or lean. By midsummer, the fields that Ceolwulf and Wulfstan sowed in spring have grown tall and green, barley heads beginning to fill and bend, and the work of this season shifts from planting to the endless essential labour of maintenance, weeding, watching for signs of blight or pest, repairing the boundary hedges and fences that keep livestock from wandering into growing crops. The days are long now, properly long, daylight stretching from well before Ceolwulf wakes to well after the evening meal, and the household's rhythm stretches with it, work filling nearly every lit hour, because a farming family in this world understands, with a clarity that modern life rarely demands, that summer's abundance of daylight is not leisure, it is opportunity, and opportunity wasted in June is hunger felt in February. Ajith, older now by these several months, has taken on real responsibilities of her own, tending the kitchen garden that sits close by the house, a small plot where Aethilgifu grows herbs, onions, and leafy vegetables that supplement the household's diet beyond what the main fields provide, cabbages and leeks, and a patch of peas that Edgith has developed a proprietary fondness for, eating them raw straight from the pod when she thinks nobody is watching, though Aethilgifu of course always notices and mostly lets it pass, because a child eating vegetables straight from a garden is not exactly a crime worth punishing. There is a wedding in the settlement this summer, a match between a young woman from a neighbouring farm and a young man whose family holds land not far from the newly rising burh, and the whole community turns out for it in a way that reveals something about how celebration functions in this society, not as an isolated private event, but as a wholly communal occasion, an excuse for an entire scattered rural population to gather, to eat together, to set aside, for a single day, the endless grinding rhythm of agricultural labour. The ceremony itself is brief by later standards, conducted at the church door by Ceolwulf before the couple and witnesses move inside for a blessing. The legal and religious dimensions of the marriage, handled with a kind of practical directness that would likely surprise anyone expecting the elaborate ritual of later medieval weddings. What follows, though, the feast afterward, held on open ground near the church with tables borrowed and pulled from half a dozen households, stretches long into the evening, and it is here that the community's warmth shows itself most fully. Families who might otherwise see each other only in passing, sharing food, sharing stories, the children of the settlement running loose in the particular unsupervised freedom that a large gathering of trusted neighbours allows. Wulfstan, 15 now, or nearly so, spends much of the celebration in the company of other boys his age, and there is a particular energy to teenage boys at a wedding feast in any century, a kind of restless showing off, wrestling matches breaking out on the grass, boasting about who can throw a stone furthest, and Ceolwulf watches his son from a distance with the particular mixture of pride and mild exasperation that fathers have likely felt at exactly this kind of display since long before recorded history began. Aethelgifu, meanwhile, sits with a cluster of other women, and the conversation there moves easily between practical matters, whose flax crop looks strongest this year, whose preserved stores lasted best through the recent winter, and softer things too, gentle teasing about the newly married couple, quiet advice offered from older women to younger ones about what marriage actually asks of a person once the feasting is over and the ordinary daily grind resumes. This is the texture of community in Alfred's Wessex worth understanding. Not simply survival, not simply labour, but genuine, warm, deeply woven social connection. The kind that made a crisis like the one this family lived through the previous winter survivable in the first place, because nobody in a settlement like this one was ever truly facing hardship entirely alone. Harvest arrives in late summer with the particular urgency that no other season in the farming calendar quite matches, because everything Sealwolf's family has invested since the frost first lifted, all those months of ploughing and sowing and weeding and worrying about weather, now comes down to a narrow window of days in which the grain must be cut, gathered and secured before rain or wind or some late blight can undo an entire year's labour in a single unlucky afternoon. The whole household works the fields during harvest, and this is one of the few times in the yearly cycle when the usual division of labour blurs almost entirely. Aethelgifu out cutting barley alongside Sealwolf, a curved iron sickle in each of their hands, moving with the steady, practiced rhythm of people who have done this every year of their adult lives, grasping a handful of stalks with one hand and drawing the blade through close to the ground with the other, the cut stalks laid in neat rows behind them to be gathered and bound. Wulfstan and even Edgith, young as she still is, have roles too, following behind to gather the cut stalks into sheaves, binding each bundle with a twist of straw in a motion that takes some practice to get right. Edgith's early attempts loose and lopsided until Wulfstan, with the particular patient superiority of an older sibling who has just mastered something himself, shows her the proper twist, and by the second day her sheaves hold together nearly as well as anyone's. Neighbours help each other during harvest too, in the same spirit of mutual obligation that governs the shared use of plough oxen, families moving between each other's fields in the days when the weather holds, an informal but deeply reliable system of reciprocity that means no single household, however small, faces this critical window entirely alone. Osgar's family works alongside Sealwolf's for 2 full days, and Sealwolf's family will return the favour on Osgar's own land within the week, and this back and forth, repeated across dozens of farmsteads throughout the district, functions as a kind of social insurance far more reliable than anything written down, built entirely on years of accumulated trust and the simple, practical understanding that everyone's harvest depends, in the end, on everyone else's willingness to show up when needed. The cut and bound sheaves are stacked in the field for a period to dry further before being carried, cartload by cartload, to the threshing area near the house, and threshing itself, separating the grain from the stalk and husk, is its own considerable labour, performed with wooden flails, long-handled tools with a shorter swinging section attached by a leather hinge, swung down repeatedly against the spread grain to knock the kernels loose. This work continues over several days following the actual harvest, often in whatever covered space a household has available, and it fills the air with a fine itchy dust that clings to skin and clothing and makes everyone in the household sneeze more than usual for the better part of a week. Once threshed, the grain must be winnowed, tossed gently into the air on a windy day so that the lighter chaff blows away while the heavier grain kernels fall back down onto a spread cloth, a task that depends entirely on cooperative weather and that Aethelgifu watches the sky for with real attentiveness, choosing her moment carefully, because winnowing on a still day means hours of frustrating, inefficient labour, while a good brisk wind can clear a substantial quantity of grain in a single satisfying afternoon. The final grain, cleaned and dry, gets stored in woven baskets sealed with clay, or in wooden bins, or in some households in specially prepared underground pits lined with straw, and the exact quantity stored away this particular autumn, more than in some recent years, less than in the very best ones, will determine with real precision how comfortably this family eats through the coming winter, how much can be spared for trade or for the obligations owed to the wider community, and how much must be set carefully aside as seed grain for the following spring, since eating your own future harvest, however tempting during a lean stretch, is the kind of mistake that can compound a single hard year into a genuine crisis the year after. There is a particular satisfaction that settles over the household once this work is done, once the grain sits safely stored and the fields lie stubbled and bare behind them, a satisfaction that has nothing showy about it, nothing dramatic, simply the deep physical relief of a difficult, essential task completed well, and Sealwolf, standing at the edge of his field on the evening the last cart comes in, looks out over land that fed his family through a genuinely dangerous year, and allows himself, for a moment, something close to peace. Autumn brings its own particular labour, distinct from the harvest that precedes it, because grain alone does not carry a household through a Wessex winter, and the weeks following the threshing and winnowing are given over almost entirely to the work of preservation, the slow, methodical business of taking everything the land has produced across a full growing season and finding some way to make it last through the months when nothing new will grow at all. This is the time of year when a portion of the family's livestock meets its end, a practical necessity rather than any casual choice, since keeping every animal alive through winter on stored feed that could otherwise sustain the family themselves makes little sense once the cold weather truly settles in. Ceolwulf slaughters one of the pigs this particular autumn, a task he performs himself, with the quiet, unsentimental competence of a man who has done this every year of his adult life, and the work that follows fills the household for the better part of 2 full days. Nothing goes to waste in this process, and it is worth understanding just how thoroughly that principle governs a household's relationship with any animal it raises for food. The meat itself gets divided, some portions salted heavily and packed into barrels for longer preservation, other portions hung in the smoke above the hearth fire, slowly curing over the course of several weeks into the kind of smoked pork that will, eventually, flavour the pottage that fills so many winter evening meals. The fat gets rendered down into lard, essential both for cooking and for other household purposes throughout the year. Even the blood is used, mixed with grain and herbs into a kind of sausage that Aethelgifu prepares with practiced efficiency, and the intestines, thoroughly cleaned, become the casing for exactly this sausage, a use of materials that a modern household would likely find startling, but that this family considers simply sensible, ordinary thrift. Alongside the meat preservation, there is the ongoing work of drying and storing whatever the garden and the surrounding land have produced. Herbs hang in bundles from the roof beams, drying in the warm rising air near the hearth, lavender and mint, and the various medicinal plants that Aethelgifu relies on through the year for minor ailments, a knowledge of herbal remedy passed down through generations of women in her family, treatments for fever, for stomach upset, for the aches that come with hard physical labour, none of it written down anywhere, all of it held entirely in memory and practiced hand. Exactly the kind of knowledge that leaves almost no trace for later historians to find, though it shaped the actual daily health of nearly everyone in this world far more directly than anything a physician might have offered, since physicians, where they existed at all, served almost exclusively the wealthy. Apples from a small orchard near the house, inherited from Ceolwulf's own father, get sorted carefully, the best kept whole in cool storage for eating fresh over the following weeks. Others cut and dried into rings that will keep for months, still others pressed for their juice, which will ferment slowly into a modest quantity of cider, a welcome variation from the ale that otherwise dominates the household's drink through the year. There is a particular smell to the house during these weeks of preservation work, layered and complex in a way that the earlier, simpler smoke and stew smell of winter does not quite capture, the sharp tang of vinegar used in some preserving, the sweet heaviness of drying apples, the rich, slightly metallic smell of fresh blood during the sausage making, the ever-present wood smoke underneath it all, and Aethelgifu moves through this thick, working atmosphere with the particular focused efficiency of a woman managing, essentially, an entire winter's food security through the accumulated labour of a few essential weeks. Let us step away from the farmstead once more, briefly, because there is a detail about Alfred himself, something small and personal and sincerely remarkable, that belongs in this part of the story, a detail that connects, in an unexpected way, to this same autumn season, and to the particular way this king thought about time itself. According to accounts written not long after his death, Alfred, troubled by how inconsistently he was managing to divide his time between prayer, study, the administration of his kingdom, and rest, devised a surprisingly practical solution. He had candles made to a carefully measured, standardized size, marked with rings around their length, so that as each candle burned down, it would indicate the passage of time in a reliable, repeatable way. each candle taking a set number of hours to burn from top to bottom, regardless of the season or the length of daylight outside. There was apparently a persistent problem with this method at first, one that reveals something almost charming about the gap between a clever idea and the messy business of actually implementing it. The drafts that moved constantly through timber buildings like the ones this entire story has taken place inside, buildings with gaps in their walls and doors that never quite sealed perfectly, caused the candles to burn unevenly, faster in a draft, slower in still air, undermining the whole careful system of measurement. Alfred's solution to this second problem was to have craftsmen construct thin cases of translucent horn, scraped down until it let light through, to shield the burning candle from moving air while still allowing him to see how far it had burned. An early lantern, essentially, invented not for illumination, but for the accurate keeping of time. I find this detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something quiet and specific about the kind of mind this king had. He was not content simply to notice that his days felt disorganized. He built a tool to fix it, then noticed the tool had a flaw, and built a second tool to fix that flaw too. This is the same instinct, really, that drove his translation project, the same instinct that will drive the careful planning behind the burr system, a genuine, almost restless need to solve practical problems methodically rather than simply enduring them. It is worth remembering, too, that Alfred was doing all of this, structuring his days around burning candles measured to the hour, while also managing chronic illness, while also rebuilding a kingdom that had nearly collapsed entirely just months before, while also personally working on translations of Latin texts he considered essential for his people's well-being. There is a kind of quiet intensity in imagining a king this occupied, this burdened, still taking the time to solve the comparatively small problem of accurately dividing his own hours, as though even in the midst of everything else he could not quite let an inefficiency go unaddressed. Let us return to the wider texture of this world for a while, because there are still corners of it worth wandering through slowly before we settle, finally, back into the deepening quiet of the household we have spent tonight coming to know. The forests surrounding this settlement, dense stretches of oak and ash and hazel that give way in places to more open heathland, are not wilderness in the sense a modern visitor might imagine, some untouched natural world separate from human life. They are, instead, a carefully understood and actively managed resource woven into the practical economy of nearly every household in the district. Ceolwulf holds certain traditional rights to gather wood from a designated portion of nearby forest, rights inherited from his father and understood by everyone in the community without needing to be written down anywhere, rights that specify not just that he may gather wood, but roughly how much and which portions of forest are reserved instead for the ealdorman's own use, or protected as breeding ground for the deer that occasionally supplement noble tables. Coppicing is the particular forestry technique that makes this sustainable use possible across generations, a method by which certain trees, hazel especially, are cut back periodically to their base, encouraging a burst of new, straight shoots to grow up from the same root system, shoots that can be harvested again within a handful of years, for exactly the kind of woven fencing and wattle wall construction that built the very house Ceolwulf's family lives inside. It is a remarkably sophisticated system, developed and refined over countless generations without any centralized authority dictating it, simply accumulated practical wisdom passed from parent to child, and it means that the same patch of forest can, if properly managed, keep providing usable timber more or less indefinitely, rather than being cut once and left barren. Hunting in these woods is more restricted, particularly for larger game like deer, which increasingly fall under rules reserving them for noble use, though smaller game, hares, various wildfowl, remains more freely available to ordinary freemen like Ceolwulf, and Wulfstan, this particular autumn, has taken increasing interest in setting simple snares along paths where hares are known to run, bringing home, on his more successful days, a small addition to the family's stores that Aethelgifu receives with genuine pleasure, since fresh meat outside of the autumn slaughter is otherwise a fairly rare treat. There was, earlier this same autumn, a stretch of days when illness moved briefly through the household, nothing severe enough to leave any lasting mark on this story, but worth mentioning because illness in this world is handled with a mixture of practical herbal knowledge and genuine, unresolved uncertainty that feels, from a modern vantage point, both familiar and strange at once. Edith ran a fever for the better part of 3 days, restless and flushed, and Aethelgifo treated it the way generations of women before her had treated similar fevers, with a tea brewed from dried elderflower and yarrow, with cool cloths kept against the child's forehead, with the kind of constant, watchful attention that a frightened mother gives regardless of century, checking breathing in the dark, listening for any change in the small sounds a sick child makes while sleeping. No proper doctor's visit was possible in this world, not in any sense a modern person would recognize. No diagnosis beyond careful observation and inherited wisdom about which symptoms tend to resolve on their own and which ones warrant real fear. Sinelwulf came by on the second day, not primarily as any kind of medical authority, but as spiritual comfort, offering a prayer over the child and simple, steady reassurance to Aethelgifu, who accepted it gratefully, even while continuing to trust her own herbal knowledge as the more immediately practical response. The fever broke on the third night, as fevers most often do, and Edgith was back chasing hens within the week, the whole episode already fading into the ordinary texture of a year that held far more dramatic dangers than one child's passing illness. But it is worth remembering, sitting here now, how much of daily life in this world moved along this particular knife edge, how a fever that resolves itself in 3 days in one household might, in a slightly less fortunate one, have ended very differently, and how families across this entire kingdom carried this particular kind of uncertainty as a constant, quiet undercurrent beneath even their calmest, most ordinary days. There is a particular rhythm to cleanliness in this world that often surprises people who imagine the early medieval period as universally filthy, an assumption worth gently correcting before we move any further into this story. Bathing in Ceolwulf's household happens regularly, though not daily in the way a modern household might expect, typically involving a large wooden tub filled with water heated over the hearth fire, a labour-intensive enough process, carrying and heating enough water for a proper bath, that it tends to happen on a fixed schedule rather than as a spontaneous daily habit, often timed around the end of the working week or before significant occasions like the wedding we visited earlier this season. Soap in this household is made at home, a task Aethelgifu handles perhaps twice a year, rendered animal fat combined with lye produced by running water through wood ash, a smelly, somewhat harsh process that produces a soap considerably coarser than anything a modern person would recognize, but effective enough for its purpose, and used sparingly given the labour involved in its production. Hair washing happens somewhat less frequently than full bathing, and both Aethelgifu and Edgith wear their hair typically braided and covered, a practical response to daily labour as much as any particular fashion, headscarves and simple linen coverings keeping hair out of the way while working near open flame or bent over spinning and weaving. Ceolwulf and Wulfstan keep their hair shorter, trimmed periodically with iron shears, and Ceolwulf, like most freemen of his standing, is clean-shaven or nearly so, a razor kept among the household's small collection of iron tools, though the shave itself is a considerably rougher affair than anything a modern man would recognize, performed without the benefit of proper shaving soap or a mirror beyond a small polished piece of metal that gives back only a vague, distorted impression of a face. Laundry, meanwhile, is an ongoing weekly labour that falls almost entirely to Aethelgifu, washing clothes in a nearby stream or in a large tub using the same coarse homemade soap, beating heavier fabrics against flat stones to work dirt loose, a task that leaves her hands red and chapped through the colder months, regardless of how carefully she tries to protect them, and clothing, once washed, dries draped over branches or laid across bushes near the house on days with enough sun and wind to make the process efficient, or hung near the hearth fire on wetter days, filling the house temporarily with the particular damp wool smell of drying laundry mixed into the more familiar smoke and food smells that already fill the space. None of this is glamorous. None of it makes its way into the grand historical narratives about kings and battles and treaties that dominate how this era tends to get remembered, but it fills, quite literally, the majority of the actual hours in this family's actual lives, and there is something worth honouring in that, in the sheer accumulated weight of unglamorous, essential labor that kept households like this one functioning through every single season of every single year. Labor performed almost entirely without record, almost entirely without acknowledgement, beyond the simple fact of a family fed, clothed, and reasonably clean, generation after generation. Winter, when it comes properly this year, arrives gentler in feeling than the previous one did, not because the weather itself is any milder, but because the fear that coloured last winter so completely has, for now at least, receded into something more like ordinary caution. The stores are good this year, better than last, the grain bins full, the smoked meat hanging thick above the hearth, the dried apples and preserved vegetables stacked carefully in whatever cool, dry corners the house provides. As the days shorten toward the deepest part of the year, the household's evenings grow correspondingly longer, more hours of darkness to fill once the outdoor work each day is finished. And this is the season, more than any other, when storytelling comes fully into its own within a household like this one. There is a stretch of days around the winter solstice, layered now with Christian meaning as the celebration of Christ's birth, but still carrying, underneath that newer layer, older customs and rhythms tied to the turning of the year itself. Evergreen branches brought inside for decoration, a particular richness to the food prepared for the occasion given how much of the year's harvest still sits safely in storage at this point in the season, and a sense, shared across the whole community, of marking the year's darkest turn with warmth and light and gathered company. On the night itself, the hall is warmer than it has been in weeks, a larger fire than usual burning bright at its centre, and there is a goose roasting, an indulgence reserved for exactly this kind of occasion, its fat crackling and dripping into the flames below, with a sound and a smell that fills the entire house with something richer than the everyday scent of pottage and wood smoke. Aethelgifu has been preparing for this meal for days, and alongside the goose there is bread made with a portion of the family's more precious wheat flour rather than the usual barley and rye, and a dried fruit compote, sweetened with the last of the honey, a genuine treat that Edgith eats with the particular reverent slowness children bring to rare sweetness they want desperately to make last. Neighbours visit through the course of the evening, the whole loose community drifting between households, in a pattern of shared hospitality that stretches across several days around the solstice itself, nobody staying too long at any single hearth, but everybody, it seems, passing through everybody else's door at some point, bringing small gifts, a jar of preserved fruit, a length of ribbon, nothing extravagant, small tokens exchanged as much for the gesture as for any practical value, a way of reaffirming the bonds that have carried this community through the plainly frightening year they have all just lived through together. Sinuwolf holds a special service at the church on this occasion, and the small building, usually cool and dim, is warmed this particular night by a greater number of candles than usual, including this year one of the finer beeswax candles typically reserved for the most significant occasions, its light noticeably steadier and cleaner than the tallow candles that fill most of the room, and the community gathers close together, breath visible in the cold air near the doorway, voices joining in the familiar rhythms of the liturgy, and there is something in the collective sound of an entire small community singing together in a cold, candle-lit room that carries a weight beyond the words themselves, a felt sense of continuity, of a community reaffirming, once again, that it has survived another turning of the year. Back at the farmstead later that same night, after the goose has been eaten, and the neighbours who stopped by have drifted back to their own homes, the family settles around the hearth in the particular unhurried way that a special occasion allows, no urgent morning labour demanding an early sleep, and this is when the storytelling properly begins. Ceolwulf in a rare expansive mood, drawn out by the warmth and the good food and the general lightness that has settled over the household this particular evening. He tells, not for the first time, the story of his own grandfather, a man none of the children ever met, who according to family memory once faced down a boar that had wandered onto his land during a lean winter, armed with nothing but a spear improvised from a broken plough handle, a story that has very likely grown in the telling across 2 generations of retelling, the boar larger with each version, Ceolwulf's grandfather braver, and everyone in the room knows this, knows the story has likely stretched well past whatever actually happened on that long ago afternoon, But nobody minds, because the pleasure of the story was never really about strict factual accuracy. It was about the particular warm ritual of a father telling his children where they come from, weaving a family's ordinary survival into something that sounds, for the length of a fireside evening, almost heroic. Wulfstan, encouraged by the mood, offers his own contribution, a riddle he learnt from one of the boys he travelled with during that frightening winter journey the previous year. The kind of clever wordplay riddle that this culture particularly delights in, describing some ordinary object through deliberately misleading poetic language until the listener guesses what it actually describes, and Adwyth, determined not to be outdone despite being considerably younger than everyone else attempting to solve it, shouts out increasingly wild guesses until the correct answer, something as simple and ordinary as a loaf of bread, finally emerges, and the whole family laughs at how long it took them collectively to arrive at something so plain once they finally saw it clearly. Let us drift once more toward the wider kingdom, gently, because there is a detail about Alfred's own family worth knowing before this story settles fully into its final quiet stretch, a detail that connects, in its own way, to the very same fireside warmth we have just been sitting inside of with Ceolwulf's household. Alfred and Ealhswith had several children who survived to adulthood, and among them was a daughter named Othelfleid, who at this particular point in 878 is still a young child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, living through this same frightening winter somewhere within the protected circle of her mother's household, entirely unaware of the remarkable path her own life will eventually take. In the decades following this crisis, Othelfleid will marry into the ruling family of Mercia, the kingdom bordering Wessex to the north, and after her husband's death, in a development that would have seemed almost unthinkable within the political norms of this specific moment in 878, she herself will rule Mercia directly, commanding armies, founding fortified burhs of her own in direct continuation of her father's defensive strategy, and earning, from later chroniclers, the title Lady of the Mercians, becoming one of the relatively few women in early medieval Europe to hold genuine independent political and military authority in her own right, rather than merely as a regent or a figurehead standing in for a male relative. I mention this here, in the middle of a quiet winter night story about ordinary farmers and a struggling king, because it is worth remembering that history rarely announces its own most significant threads while they are still being spun. Somewhere tonight, in this same kingdom, a small girl is simply living through a frightening season alongside her mother and siblings, entirely unremarkable in the moment, and she will grow into a quietly formidable ruler whose own military campaigns will help complete the work her father began, reclaiming territory, expanding the fortified network of burhs, laying groundwork that her younger brother Edward will build upon further still, eventually leading towards something that did not yet properly exist in 878, a unified kingdom of England itself, rather than a patchwork of separate, often warring smaller kingdoms. Alfred, hiding in the marshes this particular winter, worrying over burned cakes and scattered loyalty, and a body that quietly betrayed him more often than he let anyone see, could not have known any of this. He could not have known that his daughter would become a ruler in her own formidable right, could not have known that his own reforms, his births and his law code, and his translated books would form the scaffolding for something as large and lasting as England itself. He knew only, on this particular night, that he needed to survive the winter, needed to hold his scattered loyalty together long enough to see spring, and there is something worth sitting with in that gap between what a person can see from inside their own difficult moment and what later generations can see looking backward across the completed shape of an entire life. Let us slow down now, properly, and stay close to the ordinary textures of this world for the remainder of our time together tonight, because there is a particular richness available in the smaller, quieter hours of a life like this one, and it deserves the unhurried attention we have not always been able to give it while moving between farmstead and marsh and monastery and noble hall. Picture, if you will, a single ordinary evening in the depths of this winter, weeks after the solstice celebration, weeks before spring will begin its slow return. The light outside has failed by mid-afternoon, the sun barely climbing above the horizon at all on the shortest days, and the household has long since settled into the particular rhythm that deep winter imposes on everyone within it, a rhythm built almost entirely around the hearth fire, since that fire is, in the most literal sense, the only source of both warmth and light once true darkness falls. Aethelgifu sits close to that fire this evening, her drop spindle turning steadily in her hands, the motion so deeply practiced by now that her eyes barely need to track it, and she watches instead the flames themselves, orange and low, occasionally flaring bright when a knot in the wood catches unevenly. There is a particular kind of silence available in a household like this one on an ordinary winter evening, not an empty silence but a full one, layered with small sounds, the soft continuous hiss and crackle of the fire, the occasional creak of the timber frames settling against the cold, pressing in from outside, Adject's quiet breathing where she has fallen asleep sitting upright against a folded blanket, worn out by a day that held nothing more dramatic than helping feed the animals and practicing her letters, since Sinewolf has recently begun teaching a handful of the settlement's children basic reading, a small local echo, however modest, of Alfred's own conviction that literacy should not remain locked away exclusively among the wealthy and the ordained. Wulfstan, nearly a full year older now than he was on that frightened winter night when he first slipped away to seek news of the king, sits mending a length of leather harness by the fire's light, his hands considerably more capable now than they were, his shoulders broader, the particular restless energy of early adolescence beginning to settle, very gradually, into something closer to the steady competence his father carries. He works in comfortable silence, occasionally humming some half-remembered tune under his breath, and there is a specific pleasure in watching a household reach this kind of quiet equilibrium, everyone occupied, everyone safe, everyone simply present together in the same warm circle of firelight, while the cold, dark world waits outside the walls. Ceolwulf, meanwhile, has taken up a task that has become something of a private winter ritual for him over the years, carving, slowly and without any particular urgency, a small wooden object, tonight a simple spoon, the blade of his knife moving in careful, unhurried strokes along a piece of seasoned ashwood he has been saving for exactly this purpose. He is not a particularly skilled carver by the standards of a professional woodworker, his spoons slightly uneven, their handles a bit thicker than strictly necessary, but there is something in the slow, meditative repetition of the work that seems to steady something in him, a private counterpart, in its own small way, to Alfred's careful measuring of burning candles, a man finding order and calm in the deliberate, patient shaping of a small, useful thing. There is a smell in the house tonight that layers several seasons at once, if you let yourself notice it properly. The base note is always wood smoke, constant, embedded so deeply into every fibre of clothing and wood and thatch that it has become less a smell than simply the smell of home itself. Beneath it, faintly, the lingering richness of the pottage that simmered earlier for the evening meal, root vegetables, and the last of the smoked pork from autumn's slaughter. There is the sharper, cleaner scent of the tallow candle burning in a small clay dish near where Aethelgifu sits, its light modest but sufficient for the close work of spinning, and underneath everything else, something animal and warm drifting faintly from the far end of the hall where the livestock spend these coldest nights, a smell this family has long since stopped consciously registering, though a visitor from outside this household would likely notice it immediately. Outside, if you were to step through the door into the full cold of this particular night, the world would present itself in a register entirely different from the warm, close firelight inside. Frost has already begun forming along the edges of the thatch roof, delicate white crystals catching what little light the sky offers, and the sky itself, on a clear night like this one, away from any source of artificial light beyond the scattered small fires of a few dozen households, opens into a depth of stars that a modern viewer, accustomed to light-polluted skies, might find almost overwhelming, a dense, undimmed scatter of light stretching from horizon to horizon, the particular clarity of stars unclouded by anything but the smoke of a few hundred hearth fires scattered across an otherwise entirely dark landscape. The cold itself has a physical presence on a night like this, a stillness to the air that carries sound strangely far, so that somewhere off in the direction of the newly built burh, Still under construction though its earthen ramparts now stand mostly complete, a watchman's footsteps along the top of the rampart, and the occasional low exchange between him and a second watchman making rounds in the opposite direction, carries with unexpected clarity across the frozen fields, two voices maintaining the quiet, unglamorous vigilance that has become part of this community's new normal in the aftermath of the previous year's crisis, a vigilance that Ceolwulf's family, warm inside their own walls, benefits from without ever needing to think about it directly. This watch is itself a direct product of everything this story has moved through tonight. Alfred's defensive reforms translated down into the concrete physical reality of two cold, tired men walking a rampart through the depths of a winter night, so that families like Ceolwulf's can sleep without needing to hold that particular fear quite so close to the surface anymore. There is something worth noticing in this chain, stretching from a king's careful strategic thinking, worked out in desperation in a marsh the previous winter, all the way down to the specific, unglamorous fact of two men's cold feet on a specific night, keeping watch over people they mostly do not know personally, simply because the system Alfred built asks it of them, and because on some level they understand exactly what a lack of such vigilance nearly cost this entire kingdom the year before. Back inside, the evening continues its slow unwind towards sleep. Edgith wakes briefly when Athelgifu shifts to bank the fire slightly higher for the last working hour of the evening, blinks blearily at the room around her, and is guided, half asleep already again, toward her bed behind the willow partition. Not fully waking enough to remember any of it by morning, Wulfstan finishes the harness he has been mending and sets it aside, satisfied with the repair, and stretches in the particular full-body way of someone whose muscles have been holding one position for too long. Ceolwulf holds the spoon he has been carving up to the firelight, turning it slowly, checking the evenness of the bowl, the smoothness of the handle where his knife has been working, and finds it, more or less finished, one more small useful object added to a household that has, across generations, accumulated its entire material existence exactly this way, one careful, patient object at a time, nothing purchased ready-made from some distant factory, everything touched directly by the hands of the people who will use it. There is a particular satisfaction available in a life built this way, worth naming, even though this family would likely never think to name it themselves, since it is simply how life has always worked for them. Every object in this house carries the visible trace of the hands that made it. The spoon Ceolwulf just finished, the wool blanket, faded unevenly at one corner, that Athelgifu wove years ago, the small clay bowl Adud eats from, thrown by the potter at the market settlement, its rim slightly uneven in a way that makes it recognizably itself, rather than identical to every other bowl in the world. There is a closeness to this kind of material life that a later, more industrialized world will eventually lose almost entirely, a closeness this family could not name or fully appreciate, because they have nothing else to compare it against, but that we, looking backward from a very different kind of world, might allow ourselves to feel the weight of on their behalf. Let us drift once more toward Alfred himself, one final time tonight, because it feels right to close this story near where we began it, in the company of the man whose desperate winter set so much of this tale in motion. By this point in the year, roughly 12 months on from that first cold morning we spent with him at Athelney, Alfred is no longer a hunted king hiding in a marsh. He has reclaimed something closer to the ordinary rhythm of kingship, moving between royal estates according to the seasonal pattern that governs a court without any single fixed capital. And on this particular winter evening, he sits in a hall considerably grander than Ceolwulf's, though built, at its heart, from the same basic understanding of what a hall is meant to be, a gathering place, a place where warmth and light and the presence of trusted people push back against the vast cold darkness pressing in from every side. He is not entirely well tonight. The chronic illness that has shadowed him since youth has flared again, as it apparently did with some regularity throughout his life, and he sits somewhat carefully, favouring whatever particular discomfort troubles him this evening, though nobody in the hall beyond perhaps Elishwyth, seated near him, would necessarily notice the small adjustments a man makes to manage private pain in a public setting. There is a document before him on the table, a portion of the law code he has been slowly compiling and refining, drawing together older Wessex legal tradition with new provisions shaped by the hard lessons of the past year, and he reads through it now by candlelight, one of his own carefully measured candles burning steadily inside its horn case nearby, marking the hours of this particular evening the way it marks every evening now. There is a quiet moment, easy to imagine even without direct record of it, in which Alfred sets the document aside for a moment and simply listens to the sounds of his own hall around him, the low conversation of retainers near the fire, a harpist tuning an instrument in preparation for the evening's entertainment, the particular contented murmur of a household that has, against real odds, survived a crisis that could easily have ended very differently. He could not have known, sitting there, exactly how the following decades of his reign would unfold, could not have known with certainty that the birth he was planning would hold, that his daughter would grow into the formidable ruler she eventually became, that the translated books he was overseeing would shape English intellectual life for centuries beyond his own lifetime. He knew only, on this particular evening, that the kingdom had held together through its worst test, that the harvest had been decent, that his people, scattered across farms and settlements not unlike the one we have spent tonight inside of, were mostly warm and mostly fed as this winter closed in around them. It is worth sitting with one last time, the particular kind of leadership this suggests, a king whose greatest achievement in this specific period was not some singular dramatic victory, but the accumulated weight of 1,000 careful decisions, defensive planning, legal reform, patient administration, made steadily and often invisibly across months and years that most of his subjects would never fully witness or understand the scope of. History remembers the burned cakes and the battle at Eddington because these make for vivid, memorable stories. It remembers less easily the countless quiet evenings like this one, a tired, unwell man reading through legal provisions by careful candlelight, doing the unglamorous work that actually held a kingdom together. Let us return gently to the ordinary edges of this world for a while longer, because there is a part of this society we have not yet given proper attention, and honesty about a time period means sitting with its full shape, even the parts that sit less comfortably than a fireside spoon carving or a wedding feast. Not everyone in Wessex lived with the relative independence that Ceolwulf's household enjoys. Enslaved labour existed throughout this society, a reality inherited from long custom and not seriously challenged by the moral frameworks of the era, though it looked somewhat different from later, more infamous forms of slavery that would emerge in other centuries and other parts of the world. Some people found themselves enslaved through capture in conflict, others through inherited status passed down from enslaved parents, and still others through debt or extreme poverty that left no other path toward survival within a system that offered few safety nets for those who fell through the cracks of ordinary household and community support. Within a household like Ethelnoth's, the ealdorman we visited earlier, enslaved workers would have handled much of the heaviest, least desirable domestic labour, tasks that even a busy farming family like Ceolwulf's manages through its own members, but that a noble household, larger and more demanding in its needs, relies on unfree labour to accomplish. A woman enslaved within such a household might spend her days grinding grain by hand using a rotary quern, a repetitive, physically exhausting task that could occupy hours of any given day, or hauling water, or tending livestock, her days shaped almost entirely around the needs of a household that held legal ownership over her labour and, in a very real sense, over her person. It would be a disservice to this story, and to the actual texture of this era, to skip past this reality entirely in favour of only the warmer, gentler scenes we have spent most of tonight inside of. Alfred's own law code, the same code he was reading through by careful candlelight in the scene we just left, does address slavery, setting out specific provisions and protections, modest by any modern measure, but notable within the context of its own time, including limitations on how enslaved people could be treated and pathways, however narrow, toward eventual freedom under certain circumstances. This does not erase the fundamental injustice of the system itself, but it is worth knowing, as part of understanding this king and this era honestly, that even within a deeply unequal social structure, There were at least some efforts, however incomplete by any standard we would recognize today, to impose some limits on the worst potential abuses. I mention this not to dwell on it at length tonight, because tonight is meant to carry you gently toward rest rather than to sit heavily in difficult territory, but because a full and honest picture of this world includes it, quietly, alongside everything else, the way any honest picture of any era must hold both its warmth and its injustice together, without pretending one erases the other. Let us move now back toward the warmth, back toward the household that has anchored this whole long night's journey, because there is not much further to go before we let this particular story close. Before we settle back fully into Ceolwulf's household for what remains of tonight's journey, let us take one more brief detour, because Wessex in this era is not only inland farms and forested boundaries, some distance to the south, where the land eventually gives way to coastline. A different kind of household lives a life shaped by an entirely different relationship with the land, or rather, with the water that borders it. A fisherman named Wigmund lives in a small settlement perched close to a tidal estuary, his household smaller than Ceolwulf's, just himself, his wife, and a single surviving child, infant mortality, and the particular hazards of a fisherman's working life, having already taken a heavier toll on this family than on the one we have spent most of tonight with. His days follow the tide rather than the sun in any simple sense, up at whatever hour the water demands, checking weighted nets and woven wicker fish traps set along channels that fill and empty twice daily with the rhythm of the sea, an entirely different clock than the one governing inland farming life, and one that Wigmund reads with the same practiced, unconscious fluency that Ceolwulf brings to reading the condition of his soil. His boat is a simple, sturdy vessel, clinker-built, overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets, small enough for 1 or 2 men to manage, and the work of maintaining it, recaulking seams with a mixture of animal fat and fibre to keep it watertight, mending nets damaged by the pull of tide and the occasional larger fish or unlucky snag on submerged rock, fills a substantial portion of his time, even on days when the weather keeps him from actually putting out onto open water. The catch itself, when the fishing runs well, supplements not just his own household's diet, but feeds into the wider trade network of the region, salted or smoked fish making their way inland to market settlements like the one where Ceolwulf's family trades, salt fish being a particularly valuable commodity during the long stretches of the church calendar when meat consumption is restricted and fish becomes, for households across every level of this society, the primary source of animal protein available. There is a particular danger woven into Wigmund's daily labour that Ceolwulf, for all his own risks, does not share in quite the same immediate way, the simple, constant physical hazard of small boat work on open or tidal water, a hazard that has already claimed, within Wigmund's own living memory, 2 men from this same small fishing settlement, and that shapes, in ways both spoken and unspoken, how his wife watches the horizon each evening until his boat becomes visible again against the darkening water. I mention Wigmund and his household briefly tonight, because it is worth remembering, even as we return now fully to Ceolwulf's farmstead, that the texture of ordinary life in Alfred's Wessex varied considerably depending on where exactly a family happened to live. Farmers and fishermen and craftsmen and the enslaved and the noble, all inhabiting the same kingdom under the same distant, struggling king, but each carrying their own particular rhythm of labour, their own particular relationship to risk and reward, their own particular version of what an ordinary evening's relief at another day safely completed actually felt like. Let us settle back now, fully and finally, into Ceolwulf's household, and let the year turn once more, because there is a particular comfort available in watching a full cycle complete itself, in returning to where a story began and finding it changed only in the small, steady ways that a single turning year changes anything. Spring arrives again eventually, as it always does, the frost lifting from the fields, the first green shoots pushing up through soil that Ceolwulf and Wulfstan will soon turn once more with the plough. And there is something worth noticing in how ordinary this return of spring feels this time, how little drama attaches to it compared with the previous year's version of these same weeks, when a missing king and a missing son had made even the turning of the season feel fraught with uncertainty. This year, Spring arrives simply as spring, welcome and expected, and blessedly unremarkable, and there is a particular kind of gratitude available in unremarkable things once you have lived through a period when nothing at all felt safe to take for granted. Wulfstan, older now by a full year, has grown taller, his shoulders filling out with the accumulated strength of a year spent in increasingly serious farm labour, and there is talk, quiet and not yet fully settled, between Ceolwulf and Aethilgifu of a possible match for him in another year or two, a daughter from a family 2 settlements over whose father Ceolwulf has known for years, the kind of practical, community-minded conversation that shapes so much of how marriages actually come together in this world, built on land and reputation and long acquaintance, rather than on anything resembling later, more romantic notions of courtship. Adjith, meanwhile, has grown too, in the particular rapid way young children grow, and she reads now, haltingly but with real visible pride, a handful of simple words that Ceolwulf has taught her alongside the other settlement children during the quiet winter months, and there is something worth noticing in this small fact. A farmer's daughter in a scattered rural corner of Wessex learning her letters at all, however modestly, a small local ripple of the same conviction that drove Alfred's own translation project, the belief that literacy need not remain locked away exclusively among the wealthy and the ordained, gradually, slowly, beginning to touch even households like this one. The household itself has settled into something that feels, on most ordinary days now, close to peace, though peace in this world is never absolute, never guaranteed beyond the length of the current season, and everyone in this family carries, somewhere beneath the surface of their daily routines, the clear memory of how quickly that peace nearly came apart just 1 year earlier. This memory does not sit as a wound exactly, not anymore, but as something more like a quiet, permanent awareness, a slightly deeper appreciation for an ordinary evening meal shared safely together, for a fire that burns steady through a cold night, for a son who comes home when he says he will, and a daughter who sleeps soundly behind a woven partition without any particular fear pressing in from the darkness beyond the walls. Shearing season arrives again with the warming weeks of late spring, and it is worth spending a little time here, slowly, because it closes a particular circle that opened much earlier tonight, when we first spoke of the long journey from raw fleece to finished cloth that clothes this entire household. The sheep, heavy with a full winter's growth of wool, are gathered into the small enclosure near the house, and shearing itself is work that requires both strength and a particular delicate care, since the iron shears, large, spring-loaded blades worked by hand, can easily nick an animal's skin if handled carelessly. Ceolwulf handles the actual shearing, a skill he has practiced every year of his adult life, working steadily through each animal, the sheep held firmly but not roughly between his knees, the fleece coming away in one continuous, heavy piece if the work goes well, the sheep beneath looking almost comically diminished once its thick winter coat has been removed, pale and thin and slightly indignant, if a sheep's expression can be read as indignant at all, which Adjith, watching from the fence rail, insists it plainly can. Once removed, the fleece itself still carries a heavy natural grease, lanolin, that must be washed out before the wool can be properly processed, and this washing happens in a nearby stream, the fleece worked and rinsed repeatedly until the water runs clear, then spread out to dry across whatever bushes and low branches the family can claim for the purpose, the whole hillside near the house temporarily dotted with pale, drying tufts of wool that will, over the following weeks and months, work their way through Aethilgifu's careful hands, carded and spun, and eventually woven into whatever the household needs most for the year ahead. New clothing for a growing son, a fresh blanket to replace one worn thin by years of use, perhaps, if there is enough surplus this year, something to trade at market for goods the family cannot produce for itself. There is a particular satisfaction in watching this cycle complete itself, wool becoming thread, becoming cloth, becoming garment, worn for a season or several, eventually worn through and repurposed into something smaller, patches for other garments, rags for cleaning, nothing wasted, everything eventually returning, in some form to usefulness within this same careful, patient household economy. It is easy, from a distance of more than 1,000 years, in a world of mass-produced, quickly discarded goods, to romanticize this kind of life, and it would be dishonest to pretend it was not also exhausting, that Aethelgafu's hands did not ache by the end of most days, that the margin between comfort and genuine hardship was not thinner than most modern households would find comfortable to sit inside of. But there is still something worth fully admiring in it too, a closeness between labour and result, between a person's own two hands and the actual material substance of their family's life, that is worth pausing to notice before we let this particular thread, like so many others tonight, simply trail off gently into everything else this family's year contains. Children in this world carry their own particular texture to how they spend whatever scraps of unstructured time their daily labour leaves them, and it is worth lingering here for a moment, because play, even in a world built almost entirely around necessary work, still finds its way into the margins of every childhood, exactly the way it always has. Ajith and a handful of other children from nearby farmsteads gather, on the occasional free afternoon, along a stretch of stream not far from the settlement, and their games carry a particular improvised, resourceful quality shaped entirely by whatever materials the world around them happens to offer. There are no manufactured toys in the sense a later world will understand them, but there are carved wooden animals that Ceolwulf has made for his daughter over the years, worn smooth now from handling, and there are games built from nothing more than found objects, smooth stones gathered for a simple tossing and catching game, a length of rope for skipping, races run barefoot along the packed earth path that connects one farmstead to another. There is a particular game, popular among the children of this settlement, that involves a leather ball stuffed tight with wool scraps, kicked and chased across whatever open ground is available, rules loose and constantly renegotiated among the children themselves, disputes settled with the particular fierce temporary intensity that children bring to matters that will be entirely forgotten by the following morning. Wulfstan, in earlier years, played this same game with the same particular intensity, and there is something worth noticing in watching how quickly a childhood like this one moves a person from that kind of unstructured play into the serious adult-weighted labour of managing land and livestock, and, eventually, a household of one's own, a transition that happens considerably faster and with considerably less cushioning than it will in later centuries, though it happens even so with its own kind of tenderness. Parents watching their children's remaining years of true childhood with a particular bittersweet attention, knowing exactly how limited that stretch of relatively carefree time actually is. Storytelling remains, throughout all of this, one of the primary forms of entertainment available to households across every level of this society, and it is worth understanding just how central it was, how much of what we would now call literature, history, and even practical education travelled entirely through spoken performance rather than through any written page. The riddles Wulfstan shared at the winter solstice gathering represent one small slice of an enormously rich oral tradition, one that includes longer heroic tales as well, stories of legendary warriors and monsters and ancient kings, some of which will eventually be written down by monks like the ones we visited in the scriptorium earlier tonight, preserved almost by accident for a much later world to eventually discover and marvel at, though the vast majority of what was actually told around fires like Ceolwulf's, night after night, generation after generation, has vanished entirely, leaving no trace at all beyond the simple, unrecorded fact that it once brought warmth and wonder to people gathered exactly the way this family gathers most evenings, faces lit by firelight, attention held by nothing more elaborate than a well-told story and a patient, practiced voice. Let us look for a moment more closely at what this family actually wears, because clothing in this world carries a specificity worth understanding properly, rather than leaving as a vague background impression. Ceolwulf's everyday garments consist of a long-sleeved wool tunic reaching to roughly mid-thigh, belted at the waist with a leather strap from which small useful items hang, a knife in its sheath, a small pouch for whatever odds and ends a working day requires. Beneath the tunic he wears simple linen undergarments, and on his legs wool trousers or leg wrappings, long strips of woven cloth wound spiral fashion from ankle to knee, both for warmth and for practical protection while working in briar and bramble-filled fields and forest edges. His shoes are simple leather, turn shoes made by folding a single piece of leather around the foot and stitching it closed along the top, sold thinly enough that the wearer can feel the ground beneath them with real immediacy, a far cry from the thick, cushioned soles a later world will take entirely for granted. Aethelgifu's clothing follows a broadly similar logic, adapted to what is considered appropriate for a woman of her standing, a long linen underdress reaching to her ankles, and over it a wool overdress, sleeveless or with short sleeves, held at the shoulders with a pair of brooches, oval in shape, bronze, decorated with a simple incised pattern, practical fasteners that also happen to be the closest thing to jewellery that a household of this modest standing regularly owns, passed down, in fact, from Aethelgifu's own mother, worn on nearly every day of her adult life until the metal itself has taken on the particular soft, worn shine that comes only from decades of handling. Her hair, as mentioned earlier, stays covered during most working hours with a simple linen head covering, wrapped and secured in a style common across the region, and on special occasions, like the wedding feast we visited earlier this year, she has a finer version of this same basic wardrobe, an overdress dyed a richer colour than her everyday garments, reserved carefully for exactly these occasions, since the dye itself represents real invested labour and expense that a household of this standing cannot afford to apply to every single garment. The children's clothing follows similar patterns scaled down, though there is less distinction in cut between boys' and girls' garments at Edith's young age than there will be once she grows older, both children wearing simple tunics suited to active outdoor childhoods, garments that get patched and let out and eventually handed down or repurposed as they outgrow them. Nothing wasted, everything stretched as far as careful mending and thoughtful reuse can possibly stretch it. There is a particular practical wisdom embedded in all of this clothing, developed across generations of people who understood their climate and their labour intimately, layers that can be added or removed as the day's temperature shifts, materials chosen for durability and warmth over any purely decorative concern, and a general aesthetic that values careful, competent craftsmanship over ornamentation for its own sake, though ornamentation does appear, in the brooches, in the woven patterns some households favour, in small touches that carry both practical function and a quiet, personal expression of identity and care. Let us move now toward the height of summer once more, a full turning of the year on from where this story first began, because there is one more community gathering worth spending time inside before we let this long night's journey finally settle toward its close. Midsummer, in this world, carries its own particular weight, distinct from the winter solstice celebration we visited earlier, a marking of the year's longest day rather than its shortest, and the settlement gathers again, this time in the warm, extended evening light that midsummer offers, daylight stretching so long that the community's usual rhythm shifts entirely, fires lit more for gathering and cooking than for any real need of warmth or light against the dark, since true dark barely arrives at all during these particular weeks. There is a bonfire built on open ground near the church, a tradition that predates the formal Christian calendar layered over it, carrying older associations with the sun's peak and the turning of the agricultural year, and the whole community gathers around it as the long evening finally begins to soften towards something like dusk, children weaving between the adults with the particular wild energy that a warm evening and a large fire seem to summon in children of any century, Edith among them, her earlier reticence around large gatherings long since worn away by a year of growing older and more comfortable in her own small place within this community. Food is shared communally on an occasion like this one, each household contributing what it can, and the resulting spread reflects, in its modest way, the full accumulated abundance of a summer season, early vegetables from kitchen gardens, the last of the previous year's stored apples pressed into a sweet drink, fresh cheese made from the milk of the household's few animals, bread, always bread, the steady essential foundation beneath nearly every meal this society produces. Aethelnoth, the ealdorman, makes an appearance at this particular gathering, a gesture of goodwill that costs him little but that means something real to the community receiving it, a reminder that even in a hierarchical world with real and meaningful differences in status and wealth, there remains a genuine functioning thread of mutual obligation running between a nobleman and the ordinary freeman whose loyalty and labour his own position ultimately depends upon. He speaks briefly, informally, thanking the gathered community for their resilience through what has now become known, in the settled language of hindsight, simply as the hard winter, and there is a particular warmth in how the community receives this acknowledgement, not grovelling gratitude but something more like mutual recognition, a shared understanding that everyone present survived something together, and that the survival itself is worth this small, simple ceremony of collective remembering. Ceolwulf stands near the edge of the gathered crowd with Athel-Gifu beside him, watching Wulfstan, taller now, laughing with a cluster of other young men his age, watching Adaid chase fireflies at the fire's edge with a fierce, focused joy that only a child fully present in a single perfect summer evening can manage. And there is a moment, brief and entirely unremarkable to anyone watching from outside this family, in which Ceolwulf reaches for Athel-Gifu's hand, and she lets him take it, and neither of them says anything about it at all, because after 18 years of marriage and one entirely frightening winter survived together, some things simply do not need to be said out loud to be fully understood between two people. The burh itself, the fortified settlement whose construction we glimpsed taking shape during that first busy spring after the crisis, has grown considerably in the year since, its earthen ramparts now properly established, topped with a timber palisade that gives the whole settlement an utterly different silhouette against the sky than it carried before, a visible, physical statement of the kingdom's renewed capacity to defend itself. Within its walls, a small but growing cluster of activity has begun to take root, a handful of craftsmen who once worked scattered across the wider countryside, finding it advantageous to relocate closer to the protection and the concentrated trade opportunity the fortification offers, and there is talk, still tentative, still more hope than certainty, that this modest settlement might eventually grow into something resembling a proper market town, one of the many such places quietly taking shape across Wessex in these years, as Alfred's defensive network gradually reshapes the practical geography of where people choose to live and work. Beorhtric the smith has, in fact, moved his forge within the burh's walls this past year, a decision driven partly by the increased security it offers and partly by simple practical opportunity, since a fortified settlement drawing in more travellers and more concentrated trade means more work for a skilled smith than a scattered rural forge could ever hope to attract on its own. His apprentice, the boy who once worked the bellows with such steady patience, has grown into the work considerably, beginning now to handle simpler repairs himself under Beorhtric's watchful supervision, the slow generational transfer of craft knowledge continuing exactly the way it always has, one patient apprenticeship at a time. There is something worth noticing in this quiet transformation, a settlement that was, just 2 years earlier, nothing more than a scattering of farms around a small wooden church, gradually becoming something with genuine civic weight, defensive walls, a growing concentration of skilled craft, the early stirrings of what will eventually become, across the following decades and centuries, a proper English town, its basic shape and location determined almost entirely by decisions Alfred made during the desperate, uncertain months we spent tonight watching him endure from inside a hidden fortress in the marshes. It is worth remembering, sitting here now with a full year's distance from where this story began, just how directly the ordinary, unremarkable comfort available to families like Ceolwulf's, safety enough to hold a midsummer bonfire without real fear, prosperity enough to consider matches and marriages for a growing son, stability enough for a young daughter to learn her letters in relative peace, traces back to decisions made by exhausted, frightened, chronically ill men working with almost nothing, in conditions that offered no guarantee whatsoever of the outcome we now know, from this comfortable distance, actually arrived. Let us pause here for a moment, before we let this story settle fully toward its close, to offer a small correction to a common misunderstanding about the wider world beyond Wessex's borders, because the picture painted so far tonight of Vikings as purely a raiding, destructive force tells only part of a considerably more complicated truth. The same broad culture that produced Guthrum's raiding army also produced skilled traders, farmers, craftsmen, and settlers, people who travelled the same seas and rivers not to burn and plunder, but to establish trading posts, to farm new land, to marry into local populations and build lasting communities that would, within a generation or two, become simply another thread woven into the broader fabric of English life. Even within the Danelaw, the territory Guthrum and his followers settled following their treaty with Alfred, ordinary daily life for most people looked remarkably similar to the ordinary daily life we have spent tonight inside of. Farmers working fields, women spinning wool, children learning trades, communities gathering for festivals and markets, the fundamental rhythms of agricultural, pre-industrial life proving considerably more durable and more universal than the political and military conflicts that dominate the more dramatic version of this history. Trade between Wessex and the Danelaw, even in these early years following the treaty, likely continued in modest, practical ways, since economic necessity has a way of gradually overriding recent hostility, merchants and traders finding roots and relationships that persist regardless of which particular political arrangement happens to govern the territory they pass through. Within a few generations, the cultural and even linguistic boundaries between these once warring populations will blur considerably. Old Norse words working their way permanently into the English language place names across what was once the Danelaw still carrying, to this day, clear traces of Scandinavian settlement, a legacy considerably more complicated and more richly woven than a simple story of conquest and resistance can fully capture. I mention this not to undercut the very real danger and disruption this particular winter's crisis represented for families like Sealwolf's, but because it feels honest, sitting here with the benefit of considerable hindsight, to acknowledge that the story of this era does not resolve into a simple binary of heroic English resistance against purely villainous raiders. It resolves instead into something more thoroughly human, populations in conflict finding their way, gradually and imperfectly, toward coexistence, exchange, and eventually a shared future neither side could have fully predicted from inside the fear and uncertainty of 878. Let us take one final detour before we return, for the last time tonight, to the quiet warmth of Sealwolf's household, because there is a corner of the monastery we visited earlier that deserves a little more of our attention, a place where care for the sick and injured takes shape in ways worth understanding properly. Most monasteries of any real size maintain a small infirmary, a separate building or dedicated section set aside for the care of the ill, and the monks who staff it draw on a body of medical knowledge considerably more organized and text-based than the herbal wisdom Aethelgifu relies on at home, though it shares many of the same underlying assumptions about the natural world, since both traditions understand illness largely through the lens of humoral theory, the ancient belief that health depends on a proper balance among four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, an understanding of medicine that will persist, largely unchanged, for many centuries yet to come, well beyond anything this particular story can see forward into. The monastery garden includes a section specifically dedicated to medicinal herbs, more extensive and more carefully documented than the modest kitchen garden plot Aethelgifu tends at home. Plants cultivated specifically for their healing properties, alongside a small collection of texts painstakingly copied by the same patient scribes we watched earlier, containing recorded remedies and treatments passed down from earlier medical writers, some tracing back ultimately to ancient Greek and Roman sources, translated and adapted across centuries of monastic scholarship into something the healers of Alfred's Wessex can actually use. A monk skilled in this work might treat wounds with poultices combining various herbs believed to draw out infection, might set broken bones with a competence that, while lacking any true understanding of the underlying anatomy in the way a later medical tradition will develop, still drew on centuries of accumulated practical experience about what generally helped a bone heal straight rather than crooked. Surgery, where it happened at all, remained crude and dangerous by any modern standard, performed without anesthesia beyond perhaps a strong dose of alcohol or certain sedating herbs, and without any real understanding of infection in the way we understand it now, meaning that even a successful procedure carried real ongoing risk in the days and weeks that followed. It is worth remembering, holding this alongside everything else we have learnt tonight about Alfred's own chronic illness, just how much genuine physical suffering moved quietly beneath the surface of daily life in this era, endured by kings and farmers and monks alike, managed as best this world's accumulated knowledge allowed, but never fully solved, never fully understood in the way later centuries of medical science would eventually make possible. There is a particular kind of resilience required to live inside a world like this one, a willingness to carry on, to plough the fields and mend the nets, and translate the books and raise the children, all while knowing that illness and injury remained, in ways both large and small, considerably more dangerous and considerably less treatable than anything most of us listening to this story tonight will ever need to personally face. Autumn arrives once more, the second full autumn this story has carried us through, and the harvest this year proves clearly good, better than the year before, the fields yielding a surplus generous enough that Ceolwulf, after careful calculation with Aethelgifu at the hearth one evening, decides the family can afford to trade a portion of stored grain for something beyond mere necessity this year, a length of fine-dyed cloth for Aethelgifu, a small luxury she has quietly wanted for some time without ever mentioning it directly, and a proper iron knife for Wulfstan, marking, in its own small way, his passage into something closer to full adult responsibility within the household. There is a particular ease to this second autumn's preservation work that the first anxious year did not carry. The same tasks, the same slaughtering and salting and drying and storing, performed now with the settled confidence of a family that has weathered genuine crisis and come through it intact, every motion a little less fraught, a little more simply itself, unburdened by the particular sharp edge of fear that coloured so much of the previous year's version of these same chores. Ceolwulf remarks on this shift himself, in a quiet conversation with Aethelgifu one afternoon near the church, noting how different the whole community feels this year compared with the last, a kind of collective exhale that has settled over the entire settlement now that the worst has actually passed, now that the burh stands properly fortified, now that Alfred, by every report reaching this corner of Wessex, continues to hold his kingdom together with a steadiness that seemed deeply uncertain just 2 years earlier. The winter that follows, the second winter this story has walked us through, settles in gently, without the particular dread that shadowed the first, and Ceolwulf's household prepares for it with the calm, practiced efficiency of people who know exactly what the coming months will ask of them, and trust reasonably in their own accumulated stores and their own hard-won resilience to meet those demands. And so we arrive, at last, at another ordinary winter evening in this small farmstead, not so very different from the one we first stepped into so many hours ago, and there is something quietly moving in returning here now, with everything we have learnt and everywhere we have travelled in the time between. The fire burns low and steady in the same hearth it has always burned in, the same particular orange light catching the same worn wooden beams overhead, and Ceolwulf sits in his usual place, working at another small carved object, unhurried, content, the particular physical ease of a man whose body still aches from a day's labour, but whose mind for once carries no especially heavy weight beyond the ordinary rhythm of an ordinary life well tended. Aethelgifu spins beside him, the drop spindle turning in the same practised motion it has turned in for nearly 2 decades of marriage, and if you looked closely, you might notice a few more strands of grey threading through her hair than were there when this story began, the small, quiet accumulation of years that no single dramatic event marks but that simply arrives, steadily, the way all real time actually passes, in thousands of ordinary evenings exactly like this one, rather than in the handful of dramatic turning points that stories tend to remember most clearly. Wulfstan is nearly grown now, spending less of his evenings by this particular fire as his own adult life begins, quite naturally, to take shape around him, and there is a particular bittersweet quality to watching a child move steadily toward independence, pride, and a small private grief walking hand in hand the way they always do for parents watching this same transition unfold, in any century, in any household, under any king. Yegith, though, still curls close to the fire on evenings like this one, still young enough that the day's play has left her properly, honestly tired, and she has fallen asleep again tonight against a folded blanket near her mother's feet, her breathing slow and even, one hand still loosely curled around a small carved wooden bird that Ceolwulf made for her years ago, worn smooth now from years of handling, from years of exactly this kind of sleepy evening comfort. There is a particular quality to this specific hour of a winter evening, worth sitting inside of one final time before we let this whole long story finally close. The work of the day is done, the animals are settled, the door is barred against the cold pressing in outside, and inside, everything necessary has been seen to, the fire fed, the stores checked, the children accounted for, and there remains only this, the simple accumulated warmth of a family gathered safely together at the close of another day successfully survived. Somewhere beyond these walls, in a kingdom that has, against real odds, held itself together and even begun to flourish, a king who once hid in a marsh continues his own patient work, his careful candles marking his hours, his translated books slowly reshaping how an entire generation understands its own history and its own possibilities, his daughter growing steadily toward a future none of us, sitting here in this quiet firelit hall, could yet fully imagine. Somewhere beyond these walls, a smith works iron into tools that will outlast the hands that shaped them. A fisherman reads a tide that has governed his family for generations. A community gathers, season after season, around fires lit for warmth and fires lit for celebration, each one a small, steady point of light scattered across a dark, cold landscape that has, slowly, patiently, proven itself considerably more resilient than it ever looked from inside its worst and most frightening moments. And here, in this one particular hall, on this one particular ordinary night, a family simply rests. Ceolwulf sets aside his carving, the object finished, another small useful thing added to a household built, patiently, one careful object and one steady season at a time, out of exactly this kind of quiet, unglamorous devotion. Aethilgafo winds the last of her spun thread for the evening and sets the spindle down. Wulfstan, home again tonight after all, stretches and rises to check the door bar one final time, a task he has quietly taken over from his father this past year, without either of them ever formally discussing the handover. And Adjeth sleeps on, undisturbed, safe, warm, entirely unaware of how much careful, patient work by so many different hands, a king's, a smith's, her own mother's and father's, has gone into making this particular ordinary safety possible. The fire is banked for the night, the coals covered carefully to hold their heat until morning. The last candle is pinched out, its thin thread of smoke curling upward into the darkness of the roof beams before dissolving entirely, and the house settles, finally, fully, into the deep quiet stillness of a Wessex winter night, the wind finding its familiar small gaps in the timber walls, the livestock shifting occasionally at the far end of the hall, the whole small world of this one particular family drawing its next slow steady breath, and then another, carrying them gently, unremarkably, gratefully, toward whatever tomorrow happens to bring. There is one further detail about Alfred worth carrying with us into these final quiet minutes, something that belongs to slightly later years than the winter we spent most of tonight inside of, but that connects naturally enough to everything else we have learned about this particular king's restless, practical mind. In the years following the crisis of 878, as Alfred's kingdom stabilized and his attention turned increasingly toward preventing any future crisis of quite this magnitude, he began experimenting with a new approach to naval defense, ordering the construction of ships considerably larger than the vessels typically used by the raiding forces that had troubled his coastline for so many years. According to accounts written not long after, these new ships were nearly twice the length of the Viking longships they were designed to counter, built both taller and steadier in the water, intended to give any crew sailing them a genuine advantage in the kind of coastal skirmishes that had for so long favoured the smaller, swifter raiding vessels approaching from across the sea. The experiment met with only partial success, if surviving accounts are to be trusted, the larger ships proving somewhat unwieldy in practice, difficult to manoeuvre with the same responsiveness as their smaller counterparts, and it would be easy, looking back, to treat this simply as a failed early attempt rather than anything worth particular admiration, but I find myself drawn to it anyway, this image of a king who had already survived hiding in a marsh, already rebuilt a shattered kingdom from almost nothing, already reformed his laws and his defensive network and his people's access to learning, still restlessly searching for the next problem worth solving, still willing to experiment, to risk an imperfect solution rather than simply accepting the status quo his kingdom had inherited. Some later historians will credit Alfred, with only slight exaggeration, as a kind of founding figure in the long tradition of English naval development, a designation that traces back in the end to exactly this kind of persistent, practical tinkering, a king unwilling to let any part of his kingdom's vulnerability go unexamined. Let us turn finally towards sleep itself, because that is where this whole long night has always been quietly leading, and there is a particular comfort in understanding, in real physical detail, what sleep itself actually looked and felt like inside a household like the one we have spent tonight coming to know so well. The bed Ceolwulf and Aethelgifu share is a simple wooden frame, low to the ground, its base a lattice of rope strung tightly enough to provide some give and support beneath a mattress filled with straw, refreshed each autumn with the new season's harvest, so that it retains something close to its original loft and comfort, rather than compressing entirely flat, the way a mattress left unrefreshed across many years inevitably would. Over this base sit layers of woolen blankets, the same kind Aethelgifu has spent so many hours of her life spinning and weaving, some dyed, some left the natural undyed cream and brown of the wool itself, layered according to the season's particular cold, heavier and more numerous through the depths of winter, lighter through the milder stretches of the year. There are no proper pillows in the sense a later world will understand them, but there are small stuffed cushions, filled with wool scraps too short and irregular to be properly spun, that serve a similar softening purpose beneath the head, and the whole arrangement, while simple by any later standard, provides a distinctly restful sleeping surface, one this family has slept on for the entirety of their marriage, one that carries, in its worn, softened contours, the accumulated shape of nearly 2 decades of shared ordinary nights. Behind the willow partition, Wulfstan and Adgith sleep on similar though smaller arrangements, close enough to each other that on the coldest nights they sometimes drag their blankets together into one shared nest of warmth, an arrangement that will not last much longer now that Wulfstan is nearly grown and increasingly conscious of exactly this kind of childhood habit, but that has served this family well across countless cold winter nights, siblings sharing warmth, the way siblings across every century and every culture have always found their way toward, instinctively, without needing to be taught. There is a particular quality to falling asleep in a world without any artificial light beyond fire and candle, without any of the countless small electronic glows that fill a modern bedroom even after the main lights go out, a darkness so complete and so total once the fire is properly banked, that the eyes, after a few minutes of adjustment, begin to perceive even the faintest gradations of light, the barely visible outline of the roof beams overhead, the faint orange memory glowing at the hearth's edge. Sleep in this world follows patterns that some historians believe differed meaningfully from the single unbroken block of rest that later, more artificially lit centuries would come to expect as normal. There is evidence, scattered across various sources from this broader era, suggesting that a first sleep, several hours long, followed by a period of quiet wakefulness in the deep hours of the night, before a second sleep carried the sleeper through toward dawn, may have been a common and unremarkable pattern across much of pre-industrial Europe, a rhythm shaped naturally by the total darkness and the absence of any pressing need to conform to a single unbroken sleeping block imposed by artificial lighting and rigid morning schedules. If Aethelgifu wakes tonight in the deep hours between her first and second sleep, she will not think anything unusual of it. She might lie quietly in the dark, listening to Ceolwulf's steady breathing beside her, to the faint settling sounds of the house around her, perhaps offering a quiet, half-formed prayer, perhaps simply resting in the particular unhurried stillness of the deep night before her body, on its own natural rhythm, gradually pulls her back down into sleep once more, without any clock to consult, without any anxiety about the practice, because this is simply how a night unfolds in a world that has not yet been reshaped around the demands of artificial light and mechanical time. There is something worth carrying with you from this, something gentle to hold on to as your own night continues, wherever you happen to be. If you wake in these coming hours, if sleep comes to you in pieces rather than one smooth, unbroken stretch, you are not doing anything wrong. You are simply moving through the night the way bodies have always moved through the night, for the vast majority of human history, long before any expectation of perfect, unbroken rest took hold. Let yourself rest in whatever shape rest actually takes tonight, the way a Thilgifu would, the way Ceolwulf would, the way this whole small, resilient household has always simply trusted the night to eventually deliver them, gently, safely, toward another morning. The candle by the bed has long since been pinched out. The last low murmur of the fire has settled into silent, glowing coals beneath their careful covering of ash. Outside, the stars that stretched so vividly across the clear winter sky continue their slow, ancient wheel overhead, entirely indifferent to kings and treaties and burned cakes and burrs, entirely indifferent to farmers and smiths and fishermen and monks, simply continuing, as they always have, as they always will, while beneath them, in one small timber hall among countless others scattered across a hard-won, hard-held kingdom, a family sleeps. It is worth pausing, in these final quiet minutes, to consider just how much of what we now think of as fundamentally, unquestionably English actually traces its roots back to exactly this period, to exactly this king, working through exactly this kind of desperate, patient, unglamorous effort across a handful of difficult years. The Shire system that organised Ceolwulf's world into manageable administrative units will persist, in recognisable form, for well over 1,000 years, its boundaries still faintly visible in the county lines of a much later England. The Burr network, born from Alfred's careful strategic thinking during the very crisis we spent so much of tonight inside of, will see dozens of towns whose central streets, whose market squares, whose basic urban geometry still bear the fingerprints of decisions made in response to a threat that felt, at the time, almost impossible to survive. The English language itself, the very language this story has been told in tonight, carries within it the direct legacy of Alfred's translation project, his conviction that wisdom should not remain locked away in Latin, accessible only to the privileged few who could afford years of formal education. Words we use without a second thought, ways of structuring thought and argument in written English, trace back, through an unbroken chain of scholarly transmission, to exactly the kind of careful, patient work performed by monks in scriptoriums much like the one we visited earlier tonight, monks working at Alfred's own direction, translating text after text, one painstaking page at a time, by candlelight, using ink mixed from oak galls, on parchment scraped from the skins of calves and sheep. And there is the law itself, the fundamental notion that a kingdom's stability depends on a shared, written, and reasonably consistent legal tradition rather than on the arbitrary whims of whoever happens to hold power in any given moment, an idea Alfred did not invent from nothing but that he did meaningfully strengthen and formalize during exactly the years this story has walked us through, laying groundwork that later kings, later reformers, later generations of English legal thinking will continue building upon for centuries to come. None of this was inevitable. Sitting in that fortified camp at Athelney, in the depths of that first frightening winter, listening to reports from trusted men, managing a body that quietly betrayed him with pain he worked hard to hide, Alfred had no guarantee whatsoever that any of it would actually come to pass. The Fyrd might not have gathered in sufficient numbers. The battle at Eddington might have gone the other way entirely. A single unlucky arrow, a single moment of miscalculation, could have ended this entire story in a manner considerably darker than the one we have spent tonight following, and the England that eventually emerged from these events, the England whose language and law and landscape still carry Alfred's fingerprints so many centuries later, might simply never have come to exist in anything resembling its actual shape. There is something worth holding on to in that uncertainty, I think. Something that connects this ancient half-remembered winter to whatever uncertainty you yourself might be carrying tonight, into whatever worry followed you into this particular evening's search for something calm enough to fall asleep to. Ceolwulf did not know, mending his fence and worrying about his missing son, that his ordinary life was unfolding alongside one of history's genuine turning points. Athelgifu did not know, carrying her private guilt over a final angry word exchanged with her son, that the child she feared for would grow tall and strong, and live to see his own children born into a considerably more stable kingdom than the one he was born into himself. None of them could see, from inside their own difficult, uncertain moment, how the larger story would eventually resolve. Neither can you entirely from inside whatever moment you happen to be sitting in tonight. But there is a particular comfort available in this ancient ordinary family's story regardless, a reminder that difficult winters do pass, that fires get rebuilt from careful embers, that fences get mended and grain gets stored and children come home again, that even the most uncertain and frightening seasons of a life eventually give way, in their own time, to something calmer, something steadier, something worth simply resting inside of, the way this whole small, resilient household is resting now, safe and warm, and entirely unaware of how far their quiet, ordinary courage would eventually echo forward through more than 1,000 years of history they would never live to see. Let us take one last, slow walk through this settlement before we finally let it rest, moving quietly past each of the small lives this story has touched tonight, gathering them together one final time before we close the door on this particular winter evening for good. Past the church, dark now, its candles long since extinguished, Wolf sleeping in the small quarters attached to the building, his own rest earned through a day spent tending to a community that depends on him for far more than formal ritual alone. Past the smithy, cold now until morning, Beortric and his apprentice both settled for the night within the burst protective walls, the forge fire banked the same careful way Ceolwulf banks his own hearth, embers held ready for tomorrow's work. Past the market ground, empty and quiet under starlight, waiting for the next gathering day to fill it again with noise and trade and the particular restless energy of a community exchanging goods and news and gossip in equal measure. Further out, toward the coast, Wigman's household rests too, his boat pulled safely above the tide line, nets mended and coiled, ready for tomorrow's work should the weather and the tide allow it, and further still, in the direction of Athelney, though the marsh no longer holds a hidden, desperate king the way it did on the winter night this story began, the fortress that sheltered Alfred through his darkest hours stands quiet now too, repurposed, its urgent necessity past, though its memory lingers across this whole kingdom in ways both spoken and unspoken. And somewhere in a grander hall, considerably more comfortable than the fortress at Athelney ever was, Alfred himself sleeps, or tries to, his particular illness allowing him whatever rest it allows him on any given night. Ealhswith beside him, their children settled safely in their own quarters nearby, a young daughter dreaming whatever dreams an 8 or 9-year-old girl dreams, entirely unaware of the formidable ruler she will one day become. Every one of these small scattered lives, connected by threads mostly invisible to the people living them, held together by a shared kingdom, a shared king, a shared hard-won peace, still young enough to feel fragile but old enough, now, to feel genuinely earned. Every one of them resting tonight beneath the same wide scatter of stars, beneath the same slow-turning sky that has watched over this landscape since long before any king or kingdom claimed it, and that will continue watching, patient and indifferent, and somehow also, in its vast silent way, faithful, long after every single person in tonight's story has become nothing more than a name in a record, if even that. This is where we leave them, not at any grand conclusion, not at any dramatic final turning point, but simply here, in the quiet, accumulated safety of an ordinary night, each small household settled, each small fire banked, each small worry set down, for now, in favour of rest. There is something else worth knowing before we let this particular winter close for good, a small coda about the wider world this family belonged to, one that reaches forward, gently, beyond the years this story has actually walked us through. Alfred will go on to reign for many more years yet, well beyond the crisis and the careful rebuilding we have spent tonight following, and by the time his life finally reaches its own quiet close, he will be remembered, unusually for a king of this era, not primarily for conquest but for something closer to stewardship, a ruler who took a kingdom nearly destroyed and left it, instead, considerably stronger and considerably more capable of defending and educating itself than it had ever been before his reign began. Later generations, centuries removed from the actual desperate winter that shaped so much of his thinking, will attach to him a title no other English king before or since has carried in quite the same way, calling him simply Alfred the Great, a designation earned, in the end, through exactly the kind of patient, unglamorous, decade-spanning work this story has tried to honor tonight. Careful law codes and measured candles and translated books and painstakingly built fortifications, rather than through any single dramatic victory alone. Ceolwulf and Aethelgifu will not live to see the full completion of everything Alfred's reforms eventually make possible, the unified kingdom of England that Alfred's son and formidable daughter will help bring into being, the Burn network grown into proper towns whose names still exist on maps 1,000 years distant, but they will live, both of them, well into old age by the standards of their era, watching Wulfstan marry and take on land of his own, watching Aegith grow into a capable young woman who will, in her own turn, teach her own children the same careful household crafts her mother once taught her, the same spinning and weaving and quiet, patient household economy that has carried this family safely through every hard season this story has shown you. There is a particular comfort available in knowing this, in knowing that the frightened, uncertain family we met on that first cold morning, worried over a missing king and a missing son in equal measure, eventually settles into a long, mostly peaceful continuation of exactly the kind of ordinary life this story has spent so many hours honoring. Work and rest and small celebration, repeated season after season, year after year, the accumulated weight of countless ordinary days quietly outlasting even the most frightening single winter any of them ever had to survive. Something small and specific, the kind of detail this whole night has tried to linger on rather than rush past. It is the sound, if you could somehow hear it across all these scattered miles and all these scattered households at once, of a kingdom breathing evenly in its sleep, hundreds of small fires banked to embers, hundreds of doors barred against a cold that no longer carries quite the same edge of fear it carried 2 winters ago, hundreds of families settled into whatever particular shape of rest their own night has offered them. Ceolwulf turns once in his sleep, settling deeper into the familiar shape of his own bed, one arm falling loosely across Aethelgifu, who does not wake, who simply shifts slightly closer to his warmth in the particular unconscious way of 2 people who have shared a bed for so many years that their bodies have long since learnt to accommodate each other without any need for conscious thought. Wulfstan sleeps deeply, dreamlessly, the specific heavy sleep of a body worked hard through honest daily labour. Aegith, still curled by the hearth where she fell asleep earlier, has not stirred, her small wooden bird still held loosely in one hand, her breathing slow and even and utterly untroubled. The night deepens around them, patient and vast and entirely unhurried, exactly the way this whole long story has tried to move through the 10 centuries separating their world from yours, patient and unhurried, gathering small true details rather than rushing toward any dramatic conclusion, trusting, the way Ceolwulf trusts his banked fire to hold its heat until morning, that the accumulated weight of small, careful, honest things is enough, in the end, to carry a story, a family, a kingdom, safely through to whatever comes next. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a household once every member of it has finally fully fallen asleep, a stillness different in quality from the earlier evening's quiet, when someone was still awake to notice the silence at all. This is the deeper kind, the kind that exists whether or not anyone remains conscious to register it. The fire's soft settling, the faint creak of cooling timber, the wind finding its familiar paths around the eaves, all continuing exactly as they would continue whether or not a single soul lay listening. And there is something worth sitting with in that thought too, the way a house keeps its own quiet company through the deepest hours of the night, patient and steady, holding its sleeping family the way it has held countless nights before this one, and will, if all goes well, hold countless nights still to come. Think for a moment of everything this one ordinary household has weathered simply to arrive at this particular peaceful night. A missing son found safe, a kingdom nearly lost and painstakingly rebuilt, a fever that broke instead of worsening, a harvest that came in good instead of failing. None of these outcomes were guaranteed. Each one could have gone the other way, and countless households across this same kingdom, across this same difficult stretch of years, did not receive quite so gentle a resolution to their own particular versions of these same ordinary dangers. There is no need to dwell on that thought heavily tonight, only to let it add a little more weight, a little more genuine gratitude, to the simple fact of this family's continued ordinary safety, sleeping soundly now beneath a roof that has held against every storm this particular stretch of years has thrown against it. More than any single fact about kings or battles or burrs, more than any detail about wool or bread or candlelight, the world seal wolf's family lived inside was frightening in ways yours likely is not, and comfortable in ways yours likely is not either. But it was, underneath all of that, built from the same fundamental materials every ordinary life has always been built from: work done well, love held quietly, fear carried and eventually set down, small rituals repeated night after night until they become, without anyone quite noticing the transformation, something closer to peace. You have your own version of Seal-Wolf's fence to mend tomorrow, your own version of Aethelgifu's stored grain to account for, your own version of a missing son to wait for, or a private guilt to eventually set down. Whatever tomorrow asks of you, it can wait until tomorrow. Tonight asks only this, that you let yourself rest, fully, the way this whole scattered kingdom has finally settled into rest around the small, warm, banked fire of one particular family's one particular ordinary night. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders finish settling into whatever surface is holding you right now. Let the last of today's concerns fold themselves away, gently, the way Aethelgifu folds away her spindle at the end of an evening's work, set down carefully, ready to be picked up again tomorrow, but not needed, not now, not for these last few quiet minutes before sleep finally, fully arrives. Somewhere in Wessex, more than 1,000 years behind you now, the last candle has gone dark, and the stars continue their slow wheel over a kingdom that survived its hardest winter and grew, in time, into something its own weary, hopeful king could scarcely have imagined from inside the marsh that once hid him. Somewhere closer, in whatever room actually holds you right now, the same kind of quiet has likely settled too, the same kind of accumulated, ordinary safety that this whole long story has tried to honor, one small careful detail at a time. There is nothing more this story needs to ask of you. The fields are sown, the stores are counted, the children are accounted for and safely sleeping. The fire is banked, low and steady, ready to be built back up again come morning, though morning is still a long way off yet, and there is no need to think about it now. Rest here a while longer, in this quiet timber hall built from patience and wool and careful hands, in this kingdom that held together against odds that once looked impossible, in this particular ordinary night that asks nothing more of you than to simply let go, gently, the way Adjith let go of her day's small worries hours ago, curled by the fire, safe, warm, already halfway toward whatever dream comes next. Sleep well. I will be here again next time, with another story, another quiet corner of history to sit inside of together. Until then, rest easy and let this long, slow night finally, fully close around you.